characteristics as it came on shore. And that's what makes it a very different beast than the nor'easters. And this one, though, may pull as much, a lot of cold air around, so much so that we may actually see some snow in that northeast quadrant of the storm. Now, we're talking about a little further north. But yes, I know I had to say the snow word, unfortunately. But yeah, that's all part and parcel of this massive system.
Yeah, you said snow, so let's dive right into the snow forecast because our very own Doug Gillum from here, the manager of the Forecast Center, he threw out the term very loosely. It's an unofficial term when it comes to meteorology, tropical snow. And that, I mean, we mentioned that because of the scope of this system. It's tapping in, it's drawing in a lot of cold air, wrapping around on the northwest quadrant of it, as Mark mentioned. There's a look at where it currently stands. It looks like it's slightly weakening. It's traveling over portions of the land as well. So we already saw the approach of that eye wall, and we'll continue to post some updates for you as the morning progresses from the National Hurricane Center in terms of the actual landfall of it. But overall, it's packing wind speeds of 150 kilometers per hour, central pressure 931 millibars. So that's why we're starting to see some very strong, very significant wind gusts. I want to walk you through the wind gust forecast as well as we progress into the later half of this morning, because you're probably wondering, have we seen the worst of it? Well, it looks like just out ahead of the actual landfall is where we're starting to see the worst of the waves, the worst of the winds. And speaking of the winds, we'll dive into this forecast in just a second, but I want to loop in our very own Nathan Coleman from Halifax, because Halifax has really been seeing the strong wind gusts as well as the power outages. Is that right, Nathan?
That's right. Trees completely blocking the road, trees down everywhere here in the south end, especially large branches.
All right. As you could hear, some audio problems there because of the winds. You could imagine how large this system is and the amount of damage it has been doing, especially from Halifax out towards portions of eastern Nova Scotia, Charlottetown in particular, some of the exposed coastlines seeing significant damage as well. You could see the winds, they really begin to weaken as we get into the later half of tonight as well as Sunday. However, we're expecting a lot of lingering power outages right through this weekend, unfortunately, just because of the sheer size of this storm system and the strength of it. This is what one of the models really have been putting out, the projections of tropical storm force winds. You're probably wondering, what does that mean? Let's dive into the details for you there. The criteria for tropical storm force winds are about 63 kilometers per hour or greater. And this comes from the National Hurricane Center, and they really paint regions under that risk of seeing these damaging winds. So we'll continue to monitor that. We have our very own in-house power outage risk map, and we've really been honing in on some of these major risk areas over the past several days because, again, we've had quite the warning out ahead of this storm as Fiona continued to gain strength over the Atlantic basin. Some of the major hardest hit areas extend from Halifax out towards Cape Breton Islands and out towards southwestern Newfoundland. And you know what? I want to loop in Kabir because he has all of the social updates. And we're going to be continuing to tap into our field members out across Atlantic Canada, Kabir. But from in studio, let's dive into the numbers. Let's dive into the impacts because they have been ongoing since late yesterday around that dinner hour.
That's right, Jesse. And you know what? We were just talking to Nathan Coleman out there. And of course, with all that weather picking up, the connection's a little bit interesting. But we can see here what he had posted just about 20 minutes ago are some trees down already, structures being blown apart. And actually, speaking of those winds, let's talk a little bit about what this means in terms of power outages. So for Nova Scotia, we're sitting at just over 376,000 people currently without power all throughout the province. Now, this also continues to develop as we take a look here at Prince Edward Island. Over 82,000 4,000 people currently without power there. Looking as well over to New Brunswick, 44,000. That number is continuing to rise as the system makes its way further north at about 60 kilometers an hour. Now we're starting to see power outages making their way into southwestern parts of Newfoundland. Now, how many? That's a good question, because originally it was about 350, but now we're getting up to 612 people without power here, rather 614. So that continues to evolve as the wind speed continues to pick up, Jesse. We're going to be seeing those numbers continue to increase, especially as we track further to the north. So one thing I was going to ask you is, in terms of where the system is heading, when can we be seeing that making more of an impact into Newfoundland, Jesse?
It looks like as we get into the later half of this morning, a lot of those strong wind gusts could be stretch into the southwestern shores of Newfoundland. Think the Burgeo, think all of the western shores of the island, and we have widespread wind warnings in place as well. I want to show you some of the alerts in place because they've been quite interesting, Kabir. It's not every day that you're under widespread wind warnings, but not only that, what's even more interesting are the hurricane warnings that extend from Halifax to Sydney, Nova Scotia, Charlottetown, all of Prince Edward Island under a hurricane warning, and these have been in place since yesterday. So we've had a lot of warning out ahead of this Hurricane Fiona, and again, widespread tropical storm warnings in place as well. So I know a lot of people have been posting their questions over social media, especially in New Brunswick. Am I going to be seeing the brunt of this storm? Well, the answer is no. But you have been seeing very strong waves and winds along the eastern shorelines of New Brunswick. There's a look at what wind speeds we've actually clocked in across the region. Peak wind gusts over 140 kilometers per hour. I want to actually show you some of the statistics that we've been piling for you. One actually comes from the central pressure. We've recorded the lowest central pressure across Canada, and that beat out our previous record of 940.2 millibars. You're probably wondering, what does that mean? We don't talk a whole lot about pressure, especially the general public, but when you talk about a very significant drop in central pressure, you talk about the intensity of a storm. So these are what's responsible for actually packing in the very strong wind gusts, and we've been actually breaking wind records for the month of September. That's what it looked like
Deteriorating on the docks in Louisburg.
with Mark.
You can see
look back at that.
behind me, the winds are just picking up the ocean and just flinging it up and over it.
Okay, that was a look at the actual storm damage. The waves, obviously, very significant along all coastal sections. Let's talk about what has been reported in this area, especially if you are across the southern Maritimes, really any exposed coastline. You do not want to be in this area. These are actual real-time numbers that you're looking at. So actual estimated wave heights, they're over 10, 11 meters. There's a look at the satellite imagery. Again, we've been seeing lots of heavy rain embedded with this, and actually this started yesterday, not related to actual Hurricane Fiona. We'll talk more about that with Mark Robinson because he's still in Louisburg, Nova Scotia. The winds are howling, the rain is still coming down. Mark, let's talk about the current conditions there. Have you been clocking in your own wind speeds in that area?
Yeah, I have. The fastest I've got was 97 kilometers an hour, and it was not feeling like it was stronger, or I think it was less strong than what I'm feeling right now. Now I'm somewhat protected from the winds by the structures here, but we have seen flying debris. We've seen branches coming off and just sort of scooter, just right down the parking lot here, and you can sort of see the winds. If I step back a little bit, I actually get knocked off my feet a little bit. So I don't want to be in that kind of wind blast because that could mean flying debris. There are buildings to this side of me where the wind is coming from. Any shingles coming off there will be flying quite quickly. So I think between now and we speak again, I'm going to be putting my helmet on and making sure that I'm safe. Simply because flying debris is no respecter of anybody standing out in this wind blast.
Absolutely, you do want to stay protected, Mark. Let's talk about what you're expecting in the next hour or so. Are you expecting stronger wind gusts? Have we seen the worst of it, or when can this particular area of Nova Scotia expect the winds to really diminish, or at least conditions to improve?
Yeah, you know, this one keeps beating our expectations. We thought this one wasn't going to be too bad, and then it looked, quite bad, and we thought it would come in at a certain time, and then, it came in much earlier. I expected the winds actually to be dying down at this point, and they're still extremely strong, and in fact, possibly the strongest I felt in this hurricane so far. So I'm hoping that the winds will begin to die down for just, for the sake of everybody living in this area, because of how many areas have been hit by this hurricane, from Halifax all the way out to here, out to where I am right now, which is Louisburg, to Sydney, everywhere, just being hammered by this storm.
Very widespread wind field. Let's talk a little bit about the rainfall that fell yesterday. I mentioned, the rain that areas across the Maritimes has picked up yesterday was unrelated to Hurricane Fiona, but it kind of ties in to the overall progression of this storm. It was associated with this trough, and it really swept up a lot of the moisture associated with Fiona. But what has the rain and the saturated ground paired with the winds done to this area? How does that pose more of a dangerous factor?
Well, the big issue is the trees. You soak that ground, make it a little bit soft. The roots can't necessarily hold on, and the whole tree comes over. We've seen multiple trees down around the area, and in fact, the cars you're seeing behind me are coming through our parking lot here. Sorry, just give me a second. Because there's a very large tree down on the main road over there, and you can't get out of the town. And you can't really get out of the town because of that tree and just blocking the road. People probably should not be trying to get out and about right now. Sometimes people just have to. Please just keep in mind, a lot of roads are blocked now. You're not going to be getting very far.
Yeah, travel not recommended. You do want to stay indoors today, and actually even into parts of the evening and overnight. Mark, we're going to give you a bit of a break to dry off, seek some shelter, take a bit of a break, all right? Maybe some coffee, because you've been going all night long out ahead of the landfall of Hurricane Fiona. Thank you so much. We're going to be continuing to tap into our field coverage, because we have team members scattered all across Atlantic Canada. Kabir, we're looping you back in with a social update, because you know what? It's been windy. There's been several power outages across the region. Millions of Canadians have been impacted by this storm in general. And I just want to remind everyone, we have Jacqueline Woodall reporting from Prince Edward Island through this morning. Mark Robinson, as you've seen. Nathan Coleman losing some connection, but he's in the city of Halifax. So let's talk about the impacts and what's rolling through social media. Is there anything new?
There's quite a bit actually coming in, Jesse, and as we noticed there as we went live, it's incredible that we're still maintaining a connection given what's going on. So 131 kilometer an hour gusts here from Jacqueline, and this is of course on Prince Edward Island, as we see uprooted trees, large trees too. And one thing I did want to mention to you real quick is take a look at this. This is the current power outage situation that we are dealing with. I'm going to show you a bit more about that in a second here, but as we take a look at what we can expect actually from our very own Patrick, if it liked to listen to me here, well, he was showing us that at Halifax Airport, 131 kilometer an hour winds were recorded. That's the highest ever on record for the region here. And I'm just trying to, of course, go ahead and showcase that for you. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just walk through what we see and what we're going to go ahead and know. And Jesse, I'm going to loop you back in here as well as we talk a bit about the hurricane's track, as we look at Halifax really moving through the majority of what we have seen in terms of heavy winds. What's the next region that really could be seeing the intensity of this?
It looks like, Kabir, over the last couple of hours, the track has really narrowed down to over the Cape Breton Islands. And again, we've been actually really focusing in on eastern Nova Scotia, seeing the brunt of this system. We'll play out this track for you because it does a pretty good job at where it's expected to go next. It has a slightly further northeast track out towards portions of Labrador. And we'll talk about the snow because, yes, we've been talking about the S word, tropical snow, quote unquote. I will add because it's an unofficial term, but I want to show you what happens when this tropical-like storm that's, again, losing a lot of its tropical characteristics runs into a lot of cold air. It's going to be allowing for the accumulation of snowfall across the far north, entering areas like Labrador. Not a ton of snow in the actual city, but Churchill Falls over the higher elevations, stretching all the way up to portions of northern Labrador. We're going to be seeing some snow right through this weekend, Kabir.
So, Jesse, great mention there, actually, in terms of talking about it as a tropical cyclone. This is something that we were watching, of course, when we saw the Environment and Climate Change Canada here reporting earlier this morning on the system making landfall. We're seeing the system change its shape. Especially when looking at it from well above. We're seeing it lose that kind of eye, becoming more of a tropical cyclone. Now, let's go ahead and click through and see what we've gotten here from social media. So this was from earlier. This was waves on the dock seemed to be getting worse. This was earlier on into the morning. But as that progressed, well, we're going to go ahead and take a look here at what Mark had sent us in Louisburg. Now, a lot of these boats still maintaining their lines. This was the tweet I wanted to mention earlier. So peak wind gusts so far, 124 kilometers an hour to be specific, at the Halifax airport. That was earlier this morning. This is the second highest September wind gust behind Hurricane Juan, and that was at 143 kilometers an hour. So as that continues to progress, as the wind continues to build, that means more widespread power outages. You can see here all of these areas are affected all the way up through Cape Breton as well, with quite a number there in the corner, over 376,939 people at the moment. Prince Edward Island, quite the interesting situation is that number has really risen over the last couple of hours from about 70,000 up to 82,123 people without power in the region. New Brunswick, especially southeastern parts of the province toward Moncton, we're seeing that become about 46,779 people without power, and currently 614 in Newfoundland. So that situation, again, continuing to develop as the system tracks its way further toward the north, and we're continuing to bring you those updates from social media, especially as we even take a scroll through here from what our very own teams have been putting together. So I'll be bringing you more on that later on throughout the broadcast today. Jesse, so tell us, where is this headed, and what could we be expecting, especially for our teams out there in the field? We're going to be connecting with them shortly.
Absolutely. I mean, it's headed towards portions of northern Atlantic Canada. Further north across Labrador throughout the next couple of days. I want to first start off, this is very interesting. This is what Fiona originally looked like across the Caribbean islands right before making landfall in Puerto Rico. Kabir quickly mentioned how it's been losing its tropical characteristics. It really doesn't look the same on satellite imagery. What you're looking at now is what it currently looks like across portions of Atlantic Canada. You can see there's no well-defined eye anymore. It's really being ripped apart. However, one major point that we've been really emphasizing is that regardless of whether or not it remains as a hurricane or a tropical storm or a post-tropical storm, the impacts are still very significant. And I'm looping back Nathan Coleman in the city of Halifax. Nathan, you've been seeking shelter in your car, thankfully. I know it's very windy, it's very rainy where you are. Let's talk about the impacts, especially through the city, because it's a densely populated area we're talking about with several thousands of power outages. How has the area really braced for this hurricane? Would you say that they were properly prepared?
Yes, I think everyone was prepared for this. We knew it was coming. We knew it was going to be severe. Not severe here as in places like Cape Breton, but we knew that the winds would pick up and the ground was quite saturated after all the rain. So most of peninsular Halifax right now is in the dark. I've been driving around and we've been seeing down trees, down branches around. We saw one large tree that nearly fell on top of a house. So very dangerous situation because winds are still gusting around here. There's not many people out on the roads. We're taking it very carefully as we progress along here. We don't want to stop under any large trees ourselves in the vehicle. Yeah, it definitely hit hard here in Halifax.
And we actually broke some records across all of Atlantic Canada when it comes to wind speeds. In particular, Nathan, you probably, I mean, it's not in your head, it was extraordinarily windy. We actually reported the second windiest September day on record for the airport in Halifax. 124 kilometers per hour. That was a peak wind gust. That's second behind Juan. Do you have any memory of that? Or maybe we could talk about Dorian, because that was in recent memory for a lot of Atlantic Canadians when it comes to the impacts and the widespread impacts of the area.
Yes, well, I was here during one. I wasn't a weather reporter at the time, but I was going to university here at Dalhousie, and that packed a really hard punch. I mean, there were some strong sustained winds with Juan. This wasn't quite as hard as Juan, though we did get that gust. It wasn't quite as a direct hit on Halifax, but still, I mean, in comparison to Dorian, we are seeing some of these massive power outages that are so widespread across the province, aside from, the southwestern corridor, upwards of nearly 400,000 outages. That is a large percentage of the entire grid here. So they'll take some time to repair. Crews, like bucket crews, have to wait until the gusts get down under 80 kilometers per hour. So it'll take some time to do that, to get back up there and make the repairs. But people were prepared for this because, like you mentioned, Dorian, it was only 3 years ago that many people had to go a week without power. So people are ready. They'll be indoors, and you want to stay in there until the crews get out and clear up these streets, because it is like driving around in a go-kart here. You're going around branches and lots of leaves. Some cars are covered in leaves.
Yeah, certainly not a day or a weekend where you want to be outdoors near any coastal areas. We're showing footage of the waves crashing on shore. Nathan, they've been very damaging along the coastal areas. That was actually with Dorian, the previous footage that we were showing you. I mean, Mark was out, Louisburg, he's currently situated there. The winds, the waves have been so strong. To put things in perspective, Nathan, I mean, when was the last time, we talked about this a little bit off air, Halifax currently stands under a hurricane warning. Do you remember the last time the city itself was under this warning? And do residents really take it seriously?
Yes, that would have been Dorian, and we take it seriously because we know, what it can do, especially this time of year when we've got that full foliage there, and a lot of boats are still in the water. People want to enjoy that warm September on their boat, but with Dorian, there were boats that sank that were moored in Herring Cove. But we've done some surveying here. I've been up all night, and down on the waterfront, it looks pretty intact. It looks good. We're still waiting for that high tide to hit, so we'll go down and see if there's any major wave action down there. But I really do think that really eastern portions of Nova Scotia took the brunt of the waves here, but we'll have to go down and see. And I know there's also the threat there in Charlottetown and parts of northern PEI that are really getting the back end, the northerly winds because of this counterclockwise motion.
Absolutely, the wind's wrapping around this system, Nathan, especially when you speak about an area like Charlottetown where you're really not protected by a whole lot. So the winds can really do damage along all the coastal areas. Let's talk a little bit before we go about the rain that was falling. You were live with us yesterday during our live stream, our live coverage. We saw that trough go through portions of Atlantic Canada, bringing heavy amounts of rain. A lot of people confused, actually just days ago, that same trough was situated across the northeast United States. So areas like New York were getting into the heavy amounts of rain, and a lot of residents were asking, hey, is this Hurricane Fiona? But it was completely unrelated. But it's really this rain, Nathan, that has done a lot of additional damage because you pair the saturated grounds with the gusty winds now. So are you seeing a lot of uprooted trees or other damage?
Yes, there's lots of uprooted trees. I mean, this is, like you mentioned, I started, I guess technically yesterday. It still feels like one long day, but this is my third rain jacket, third pair of pants. I mean, I started at 7 a.m. and it was raining from that trough. And then as the day progressed into the evening, we started feeling that tropical moisture. And then all through the overnight, it's just been pouring down in buckets here. Some high rainfall rates. And when you combine that with the gusting, over 100 kilometers per hour, that takes down trees, that takes down branches, and so it's just a big mess here. And even some of the trees that came down, they pulled up the sod with them. that was like laid underneath. So it's quite an interesting visual. I've been getting a lot of videos here, but we're just kind of sheltering in the vehicle at the moment to have this chat. But I'll be bringing you that coverage throughout the rest of the day, because it's quite the sight to see the force of nature.
Okay, awesome work, Nathan. You've been out, as you mentioned, all night, all day yesterday. You joined the morning show as well. We also had some very interesting footage that you sent in to us. So we're going to be giving a quick glimpse to all our viewers, taking a look at the tree damage. Have a look at this.
Well, just another massive tree down here in Halifax. This is on Shabukto Road, and you can see how it was ripped here. And this is going to be a loss for the homeowner here, because it is right up, almost touching their house now. Thankfully, it didn't fall on top of the house, but just a massive tree. And you can see what the speed of the wind is. It brought up even all the sod down here as well, and so it's going to take some time to clear that wood.
Damage. Nathan, your visuals really put things into perspective for all of our viewers. It paints the story, and it really puts, the emphasis on how serious this damage is. How, before I let you go and have a little bit of a break to, again, relocate yourself closer to maybe perhaps the water to give a different look, how long do you think crews will take to really get the city back up and clean again?
Well, they're not out right now. They're sheltering in place. There's all that footage you saw. All those trees are still there. They've been there for hours, because it's too dangerous to go out now with the other trees lingering around. Another tree could fall on top of someone trying to clear it out. So they're going to wait for these winds to die down, and then they'll be out. They'll be out with the wood chippers. It could take days. Of course, they'll start on the major routes if there are any, that one of the trees I shot was a major intersection at Roby Street, so I'm sure they'll take care of that one first, but then they'll move to secondary streets, and yeah, there'll be a lot of wood chips coming out of this one, and so once daylight happens, that's when we'll really get a bigger picture of just how widespread this damage is.
All right. Thank you so much, Nathan. We will touch base with you very shortly for that high tide, perhaps, and a little bit more of that storm damage as that sun rises across the region. Thank you again. We'll touch base soon. Nathan Coleman, thank you very much, from the city of Halifax. We're going to be continuing our live stream coverage, again, on all platforms here on the Weather Network. If you're watching on TV, as you are, thank you so much for joining us this Saturday morning. And again, on all social media platforms, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Kabir, on our desktop, on our app. It's very handy for all of the updates. And speaking of updates, I think you have more when it comes to the whole social media aspect of it.
That is right. I've been going through here and combing through what some of our viewers have been posting, and of course what some residents of Atlantic Canada have been posting. Courtney here is showing what her yard was like before and after Hurricane Fiona thus far. Take a look at this, and then of course this, given those winds, we're not too surprised to see that. But you were just talking about downed trees, Jesse, and this was an example here posted by the Charlottetown police of what conditions are like there. So not only are these power lines down, which is extremely dangerous, but we can see here some of these trees have breached roofs of houses, and we're seeing here, of course, how this is impacting gas stations as well. So quite a bit going on outside there. Let's take a look here in addition to what Charlottetown Police posted in terms of more down trees. Look at this. Wires down, of course, and very dangerous to get out there and take a look. These trees blocking entire roads. These here, I'm not sure if you can see this in the camera, but quite a bit of these power lines are actually beneath these trees, creating quite a hazard. Of course, if you see this, please don't try and clear any of these trees. Don't touch anything, because due to the high winds, we don't know where this is going to blow. And also, you don't want any of those wires coming in touch with you. As you can see here in these streets, this gentleman is quite close to that as well. So advised to very much stay well clear of that area. Now, as I was mentioning here, there's also some structural damage that's been reported to a building in Dartmouth, I believe. And you can see that it was a low-rise building, and that's been evacuated. So I'm sure we'll hear more about that. And the power outage situation, again, continuing to develop here for Nova Scotia. We're still looking at over 370,000 people without power, Jesse. And that's going to be something that will continue to evolve as those wind speeds continue to pick up. Now, in terms of what I guess we're going to be seeing, if you want to send us something, make sure to send it to @WeatherNetwork. And of course, we'll take a look and make sure that we do send it here to air. And of course, stay safe if you're outside. Jesse, we're seeing this system, of course, tracking north now, and we're going to be expecting to see this making more of an impact into Newfoundland. When do you think that will be?
Absolutely, especially when it comes to the wave heights, the winds, especially across the Burgeo, southwestern shores of Newfoundland. Kabir, I do want to continue to update everyone with the alerts currently in place. Again, these are issued by Environment Canada, and you do want to take them very seriously. What you're looking at here is all the areas under a storm surge warning, and these waves are going to be really significant and likely peaking over the next couple of hours, as Nathan mentioned, because of high tide. That's going to be occurring mid to late morning. There's also additional rainfall on the table. This on your screen, anywhere between 100 to 150 millimeters of rainfall is in the forecast, locally up to 200 millimeters. A lot of this has fallen. And again, we continue to see that being picked up on satellite imagery and radar. We are starting to see the actual center of circulation associated with post-tropical cyclone Fiona cross eastern Nova Scotia. We'll update you on the exact track, the exact location and time of quote-unquote landfall of this post-tropical cyclone. But let's take a closer look at your radar reflectivity. I mentioned heavy amounts of rainfall embedded within the system continues to fall across the region. Now, if you're in an area such as the city of Fredericton, you're really on the outskirts of this system, which is very interesting. The sheer size of this system has been absolutely incredible. And I mean, if you really zoom in to the northern fringe of this system, especially entering portions of Labrador, you're already starting to see the cloud field really pool in. It's encountering cooler air, and that's why we have a little bit of snow for areas across northern Canada. There's another look at the satellite imagery. Again, a very broad system. It's been bringing widespread power outages. If you're just tuning in, we're giving all the updates when it comes to Hurricane Fiona, or at least what was once considered Hurricane Fiona. It's slightly weakening. It's moving onshore across eastern Nova Scotia, but still triggering several power outages, lots of wind damage, lots of storm surge as well. The current power outages in the area of Nova Scotia across all the province, over 367,000 customers being impacted by this. Now, we've been showing visuals of storm damage not only in Halifax, but also across other areas scattered in Atlantic Canada. Jacqueline Whittle is in Prince Edward Island. Let's check in with her.
Okay, so we are up and ready to get back out in the hurricane, and conditions are deteriorating here in PEI. Just want to show you, you can certainly see the winds. Now, before I went to have a little nap here, just to get some Z's before being up all night, it's 1 o'clock local time AM here. Winds were gusting close to 65, that's it. So I don't know what they're gusting at now. It's certainly intensifying, as it will continue to right through the early morning hours. So stay with us all night long, along with Mark Robinson, Nate Coleman. We're all out here doing our thing, and we can keep you safe. Yeah, these are definitely gusting more than 75 now. It's got to be close. But expecting gusts up to 140 to 150 kilometers an hour here in parts of PEI with what we call a sting jet, part of the jet stream where an enhanced ribbon of air can kind of mix down and increase those winds. So a sting jet around the northern circulation of the storm. So northerly winds, counterclockwise rotation. That's why PEI, particularly Charlottetown, is going to get hit really hard. All right, let's go.
All right, we'll continue to check in with Jacqueline Whittle in portions of Prince Edward Island. She mentioned the northerly winds. Those are expected to continue right through this morning across the region. If you are in Prince Edward Island, you do want to be aware you are currently under a wind warning, a hurricane warning, and the wind speeds have been very significant. What you're looking at here are the peak wind gusts reported over the last 24 hours. These have certainly come up, and they've actually broken some records. I put together one record in particular for Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. The peak wind gust that we reported associated with Fiona has been 131 kilometers per hour. Jacqueline has been reporting live from the field. She will join us very shortly to give us all the insights of what's currently happening in that area. But also of note, you could read on the bottom line here, lowest September pressure record clocked in the Charlottetown area of 964.4 millibars. That was responsible for producing some of these very strong wind gusts. The waves also a major concern across all of the Atlantic Basin. They're creeping really close to the Nova Scotia shorelines, exposed areas of Charlottetown as well, or Prince Edward Island rather, and really creeping into portions of southern Newfoundland. Kabir, we've been talking a lot about the timing when it comes to Newfoundland. I know there's been some power outages creeping into that area, and we'll continue to monitor that because that will be the story as we get into the later half of this morning as well as the afternoon.
Yes, and we'll bring you more on that in just a moment. I do have those screens open, but first I wanted to talk about the Magdalen Islands. They're here in basically just north of Prince Edward Island and the shores of Cape Breton. Now, what we're seeing there is quite a bit going on. Check this out. This is a live, or rather was a live view there from just a little while ago as water laps up over the dock, over the breakwaters, and it's spilling over onto land there. So quite an interesting look as we take a look at something so unique and so isolated. So that's how that's affecting some of those areas there. Now, we were just talking about power outages. We were just talking about high winds. What are we looking at? So over 406,000 customers now, and I wanted to point something out to you. Customers has to deal that has to deal with the individual dwelling. So in terms of people affected, we're looking at that being at a larger number. So right now, 406,623 is the current number of customers affected. The people are likely more. That's for Nova Scotia. And as we take a look, of course, at outages for New Brunswick, we're looking at that steadily increasing a little bit, 46,000 people, and 614 currently still for Newfoundland. Again, that number is still expected to rise. Now, as we do continue to take a look at when these power outages will continue to grow, well, that's going to have to depend on where the storm goes. Currently heading north, losing a bit of that hurricane energy, rather. It's becoming more so of a tropical cyclone without that eye of the storm, but we can definitely see what it is doing here as we continue to monitor that situation. Jesse, now we're seeing those winds increasing for certain parts of the area, and we're seeing the system tracking in a very interesting direction now.
Yeah, it pushed onshore across eastern Nova Scotia. So where Mark Robinson was situated, we'll check it back in with him very shortly. But I want to show you where these winds are headed. Kabir, creeping really close to the western shorelines of Newfoundland. You can see these are the peak wind gusts. If you're in the city of St. John's or maybe perhaps Gander, you're probably wondering what storm. It's really not much of a story across eastern Newfoundland, and that has a lot to do with the exact track. So what you're looking at here is the forecast track of Fiona, post-tropical cyclone. It's been losing a lot of its characteristics. I want to zoom in here for you and show you the track as it heads way up across northern Labrador. That will be a situation as we get into late Sunday. So we'll continue to track this for you live right through the day today as well as tomorrow. These are the major impacts that we have been concerned about, and we can continue to monitor across all of Atlantic Canada for you. One being the strong wind gusts, the precipitation falling very heavy at times across especially areas like Prince Edward Island, eastern Nova Scotia. anywhere between 100 and 200 millimeters of rainfall. We've already seen some uprooted trees, some storm damage on the streets. Again, a lot of damage done to the trees because of the late summer, early fall foliage. Kabir, this is something we talk a lot about when it comes to damage, especially at this time of year. We're dealing with several power outages across the region, which you spoke to. But we've also talked about the other impacts. Let's talk a little bit about the track of Fiona, because it's had a long history. I have a couple of statistics here. Very interesting to dissect the actual scope of the storm, because it was the first major hurricane of the Atlantic season. It was the 6th named storm. Kabir, it made landfall in parts of Puerto Rico. It brought flooding to Dominican Republic, the Leeward Islands. It passed by Bermuda, and now it has significant impacts on Atlantic Canada.
Interestingly enough, Jesse, I was doing some research. There are a couple of cruise ships actually that had to avoid the storm as well, sailing especially throughout out of New York City, throughout Bermuda as well. So very interesting to see that spread, not just to Canadians, of course, now, but also even on its way to Canada was making quite a wake, of course, as that system tracked north. Now, Jesse, we were talking about how the storm's losing its energy, and as well, we did have a graphic there that we showed earlier on as we saw the system progress through our Sunday. So looking forward, more so into the next day or so, what is our morning looking like, especially as there's the potential for daybreak to come very shortly?
Well, I mean, we're going to be starting to slowly see conditions improve. You mentioned, Kabir, it losing a little bit of its tropical characteristics, and that's because it's entering cooler waters. And naturally, when any tropical cyclone enters cooler ocean waters, it begins to weaken. It enters an area of more wind shear, meaning it's going to be ripped apart. And that's why we don't see that actual definitive eye wall. I want to show you what it looks like on satellite imagery currently as we speak. Again, it's a very broad system. It's being sheared apart across the Atlantic, and it continues to, again, show features of an actual post-tropical cyclone, so really losing its warm core, if you will, and its deep convection. Another very interesting aspect when it comes to the tropics and more development is that we have another named storm, and this has been named late last night, Tropical Storm Ian. I bring this up simply because it might pose some impacts to Atlantic Canada in the extended long range. And Kabir, we were chatting about this a little bit off air yesterday. Very interesting. That's where Ian currently stands. And I want to play out the track for you watching at home, because yes, it will have major impacts to portions of the Caribbean, including Western Cuba, portions of Florida, potentially getting a landfall out of this. And that will probably move offshore and encounter portions of the warm Atlantic once again, and maybe pose some impacts to Atlantic Canada. There's another tropical storm out to sea, but we have an update live streaming for you that continues on all of our platforms. We've been talking a lot about the winds whipping around portions of Prince Edward Island in Charlottetown. We now have our storm hunter, Jacqueline Whittle. Jacqueline, it's been a minute since we caught up. You've been in the brunt of the winds and the storm damage. Let's talk about the current conditions that have been going on in your region.
Yes, a good early morning to you guys back in studio. We've been up all night tracking this storm, and we've seen the worst of it now. I think for Charlottetown, PEI, Jesse and Kabir, we've seen our winds gust up over 130 kilometers an hour here in Charlottetown, and I can just feel it now without even knowing any wind measurement that things are definitely ramping down. Also on radar, which I'm sure you're showing, there's a bit of a dry section into the storm. Now you still get the odd gust that knocks you off your feet a little, but definitely improving conditions. The problem is going to be, what do we see as daylight starts to unfold here in Charlottetown? Because throughout the evening and overnight, we've been driving around the downtown streets, and there have been countless trees, large trees with huge canopies that have been uprooted and have, landed on power lines, landed on, certain buildings, really, small buildings, small structures that we've seen. Of course, most of the whole island is without power. So it's just going to be so much cleanup once that daylight starts to happen. And it already is, actually. You can start to see behind me. I mean, we've been watching this cruise ship here behind us. It might be a ferry. I'm not sure if it's a cruise ship or a ferry, but we've been watching that all night. And I mean, it'll be really interesting to see what this storm looks like in the light, because we've only had a view so far at dark.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk a lot about the downed trees, Jacqueline, and several power outages. So once that sun rises and we get a better look at all coastal areas, we have a better sense of the actual scope of the damage being done. You mentioned the rainfall. We certainly saw that yesterday through the overnight, still falling at a lighter intensity. I'm showing radar reflectivity on the screen as everyone watches from home, because there's been a little bit of a lull. Probably wondering why that is. It's because of the actual hurricane itself, or post-tropical cyclone now, has passed over eastern Nova Scotia. It's allowed for the very heavy rainfall to pass in a lot of areas. But let's talk about the rain paired with the winds that have been reported in the area. What has that done, that damage coupled together with both the wind and the rain?
Well, here in Charlottetown, we've certainly seen some ponding and pooling out on roadways, no question. And I can imagine, Jesse, that if we were on the north shore of the island, we'd be seeing some pretty significant flooding impacts. And we may just meander up there as we get daylight, but we didn't want to drive too far when the storm was at its worst, gusting at 130 plus kilometers an hour. I wouldn't be shocked if we get reports of gusts that were higher than that, because it certainly felt like that. But as far as, flooding right here in the downtown area of Charlottetown, as you know, Jesse, because of the circulation of the hurricane and the northerly component to these winds, well, those winds were coming right over the island, so they had they're not bringing ocean water, say, down to Charlottetown, because, the water is south of us right here. So yes, the water is rising and lowering with high tide. There's certainly some piling up of that water in some of these inlets and channels, but certainly not as much as the flooding potential on the north shore. So again, when we get daylight, it'll be very interesting to see some pictures out of that area. What was the storm surge like with those relentless northerly winds hitting, a couple I think they're national parks, maybe provincial parks, but there's definitely some parklands up there, and there's some communities. We might head up to a place called Rustico. That's a little town on the north shore. There's two capes on either side of PEI, so those areas would have been battered really, really badly in the overnight. So Charlottetown, I think, really got so far from what I've seen, the strongest winds actually out of the storm at 131 kilometers an hour, which is shocking. I didn't think that would play out here in Charlottetown, but it did. And I think the worst thing that we have to watch for, just even us, my cameraman Steve Mongeon and I, is to watch for down power lines, because we've already seen them on streets, and just a ton of tree shred and tree debris that's just scattered about on the roads.
Yeah, absolutely. Jacqueline, you mentioned the 131 kilometers per hour wind gust. That was a new record, second windiest record in the month of September. That comes second from Juan. I'm not sure if you were out covering Juan or you knew any friends out in the field, because that was very interesting. I spoke to Nathan Coleman not too long ago about his memory, because he was actually in Atlantic Canada, not actually a weather reporter at the time, but a lot of people have recent memories of Juan and just the damage that was done, and on more recent memory, Dorian and the impacts with that. Do you have any comments when it comes to either one of those tropical cyclones?
Well, I can comment that I also was not in the weather game at that time, so I don't have any recollection of Hurricane Juan myself, but there was a lot of people that, you mention any hurricane and it's the first name that comes to mind here, certainly in Charlottetown from what we've gathered. And a lot of people tell me that, City Hall was extremely damaged in that storm, the yacht club, the harbor, very damaged. Because of Juan and its track, we saw more of a southerly component to our winds, and so that actually battered the area we're standing in right now. So the boats that were at the marina back when Juan hit were really destroyed, and there was just massive insurance claim against those boats. This time, because we've got that northerly wind, a lot of the boats firstly have been removed. A lot of people have learned from Juan, so they said we're just going to get our boats out of the marina. But the people that did hunker down and stay, and we met a couple pleasure craft boaters, so not fishermen, but just pleasure craft boaters, I guess is what you call them. That's what I am. I'm a boater. They hunkered down in their boats. Now, these are pretty large vessels, but they actually hunkered down during the storm in their boats. And the reason why is because they were pretty sheltered and protected, because they were nudged up against the dock. They had all kinds of dock lines and bumpers, and everybody's tied together. And the winds are coming at them from the north, and they're kind of hunkered in behind a building. So, you know, maybe not the best place to be, but they seem to think it was fine, and they've been doing it for years. And, you know, we just saw them about an hour ago, I think, Steve? And they were fine. And they're, you know, everybody's okay. So they're resilient people here on the East Coast. They, you know, a storm like this is to be taken seriously. I think the biggest thing out of this is everybody had lots of warning. Everybody has their emergency, maybe not everybody, lots of people have their emergency kits ready. They're expecting power outages to be, you know, hanging around for several days. But I think people also just expect the worst. They've seen nor'easters. They know what 120 kilometer an hour wind gusts can do. I think what really is upsetting and heartbreaking to see are the amount of large trees that I've seen down. That's probably the takeaway from this storm. You know, there's a lot of beauty in the downtown core, and I hate to think about what we're going to see as we drive around in the next few hours.
Yeah, and we'll continue to tap into all of the impacts as the sun rises. Jacqueline, Mark Robinson joins us. You know, it's interesting because this has been such a historic storm for all of the Atlantic provinces, especially across the Maritime provinces. Both of you are currently under a hurricane warning still. Several warnings in place when it comes to wind, storm surge, rainfall, as well as hurricane warnings. Mark, let's update everyone watching at home with the current conditions in Louisburg, Nova Scotia.
Yeah, I mean, they said we're in Louisburg. I just took a drive down the road here just to check out the town, make sure everything was okay. And unfortunately, I have to report that things are not okay. The strength of the winds, it actually has been picking up, if you can believe it, as we've been getting towards dawn. I got close to where we were earlier, down by the docks, and I quite literally could not pass by because a house was coming apart. Debris was flying across the street in front of me. Very dangerous situation, simply because, you know, the house was literally losing structural integrity. So there was insulation flying, bits and pieces of the roof flying past. It was just not what I was expecting to see. When I finally was able to pass by safely, I got down to the dock area, and the winds coming up the pier there, I couldn't see the boats. I could not see the boats at the end of the pier, which we had no problem seeing earlier. So the situation is quite deteriorated here in Louisburg, just because of the way this system was going past. And you can see behind me, we've still got hurricane force winds. I've actually got my helmet on right now, simply because I do not want to be hit by flying debris. So as much safety gear as possible here in Louisburg, just because we are now seeing structural damage occurring in the town.
And Mark, a huge part of that has tied into the exact track of Fiona. I want to tie in Jacqueline Woodall. She's with us as well. The winds coming in at a completely different direction in parts of Charlottetown, and the damage not as severe. Jacqueline, let's comment a little bit more about the wind direction.
Yeah, I'm having a bit of difficulty hearing you, but I think what you were talking about is the wind direction, and you're right. Because of that northerly component to our winds here in Charlottetown, where we're at, we're relatively protected. I mean, we had some strong wind gusts at 131 kilometers an hour at peak, but we've got the land between those northerly winds over the ocean and where we are down at the southern part of the island. So I think that's the main reason. I think that we would be in much stronger gusts potentially, or at least it would appear stronger, if we were on the North Shore, and certainly seeing some big waves there as well. But yeah, I mean, I think at this point it's hard to say where the damage is worse. Oh, I just heard something there. And there's a street light actually to my left that's really swaying. Can you get that, Steve, by chance? It's right over here. Can you, if you can, just take a look at that street light. that's just waving in the winds, and this is ramped down. So I can't imagine what these were doing, 2 hours ago when we were out here. But you can see that, the winds are still probably sustained. I'm going to guess maybe 60, 70 kilometers an hour with gusts beyond that. And everything's weakened too. I see another street light over there that's, kind of swaying around. Everything's saturated right now, so it doesn't take much to knock down a tree. But yeah, it's just really hard to say who got the worst of the damage at this point from this entire system.
Yeah, and Jacqueline, we actually have another record being broken, and that comes out of Sydney, Nova Scotia, a wind gust of 149 kilometers per hour. Mark, you've been situated in Louisburg, Nova Scotia, which is not too far away from Sydney, but it just puts things into perspective of how much of the system has been impacting the island of Cape Breton. Let's comment a little bit more about these. Were you expecting a lot of these records to be broken?
Where the heaviest impact was going to be, everybody was pointing to Cape Breton, and I think that's exactly what's happened. Because this storm is not like the usual hurricanes that come through and sort of blast past and they're gone in 3 hours. This one is more like a tropical system. It's come in, it's sat, and it's just beat upon the island, and especially down when you're closer to the water. And I'm actually taking a very careful look here just to make sure that there isn't flying debris coming past. I'm sort of under the overhang here. I'd probably be safe. But if the eavesdropping here, which I can actually see the nails are beginning to pull out, and the eavesdrop itself is starting to vibrate quite quickly, I'm going to have to move fast if that happens. Now behind me, you can see one of the houses back there. We just watched one of the windows blow in that house back there. As I said, I've already seen one roof rip off of another house closer down into the downtown area. And then, of course, the piers themselves overtopped with storm surge. We will start to see the winds begin to come down. But you're still, the damage is being done now. And because the storm has just been over top of here and just essentially beating upon this area for so long, this is when you finally get the structures beginning to give way. Jack, how are you doing?
Mark, it's great to hear your voice. I can tell that you've had certainly a long night, as I suspected you would, in your location, and I look forward to seeing a lot of the stuff that you have been shooting. But we've both been so busy. Mark, what this reminds me of, if you can just think back to a few years ago, you and I chased a storm, Hurricane Florence, in Wilmington, North Carolina, and you might recall that we chased all night. It was probably a Cat 1 or a Cat 2 storm, and then by morning hours we drove around that city, and there was so much tree damage, and there were so many old trees that were toppled over in the streets. I have a feeling, Mark, that that's what Charlottetown might look like in the coming hours as we get to see the damage.
Yeah, Jack, what's interesting about that is that you're getting a very different experience to me, because I think this feels almost like what we were like in Michael, if you can believe it. Not quite that extensive damage, but this constant roar that this winds have just been going on and on. Now we're sort of seeing debris flying around, and it definitely feels like a tropical hurricane rather than sort of the nor'easters that you and I have been in together. It's sort of a bit of an astounding storm.
One of the things I noticed, Mark, and maybe you can comment on this, was a lot of people here don't seem to be boarding up windows like we would often see down on the Gulf Shores or in Florida. Did you get the feeling where you are that people had lots of notice and were prepared? Because I certainly had that feeling here, that people had emergency kits ready. They knew that they could be without power for several days.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the people I talked to on Cape Breton when we were on our way here, they were like, yes, we're concerned about this. We've got our stuff ready. We're going to be able to sort of hunker down and let it blow by. Down here, though, in Louisburg and Sydney, people, I think, were a bit more concerned because they knew that this was going to be one of the higher impact areas. So people were worried about their fishing boats. down on the piers. They were worried about their buildings and their businesses. And so they were taking it seriously. And I just hope that everybody was prepared and is safe. I mean, we're not going to know exactly what kind of damage has been done across the province until these winds ramp down enough that we can actually, people can get out and see what's going on.
No question. I mean, this is the first hurricane chase you and I have had in some time because of the pandemic. Everything kind of put a pause on that, and what a storm to chase, to be back at it on behalf of the Weather Network. I hope you stay safe, and I hope you guys have access out of where you need to go. Do you have access, or are you trapped in?
You know what? I think we're trapped in. I've been seeing a lot of cars going by. Everyone's trying to get around. The main highway here, there's a couple of big trees down on the highway. So that is going to be a bit of a problem to get up, back up to Sydney and then back to Halifax. So I'll eventually get out. Jack, I hope you're okay, because I know that some of our chaser friends were concerned about you on PEI. So I'm nice to hear your voice and know you're okay.
Yeah, we're all good here. You take care, and if Jesse and Kabir in studio are standing by, maybe we can throw it back into you guys for a look at some of the current conditions here and what you're seeing in studio.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both, Jacqueline, Mark. We'll catch you very shortly through our live stream, which continues right through this morning on this Saturday. A closer look at your current conditions across the maritime provinces. Our temperatures, not very tropical-like. Again, this post-tropical cyclone has been losing a lot of its tropical characteristics, hence it's no longer considered a true hurricane. Temperatures, as you see, are in the single digits. Early this morning, the rain continues to fall across the region. Several communities still under a hurricane warning or a tropical storm warning. That extends all the way into central New Brunswick. If you're wondering what's the difference between the two, because it's not every day that we're under either one of a hurricane warning, a tropical storm warning, or a hurricane watch. Well, these hurricane warnings have been in place for over 24 hours ahead of the impacts of Fiona, and it does mean that hurricane force winds are expected. Storm surge is expected. High waves expected to impact the area in under 24 hours of the forecast time. Now, I mentioned the rain. That continues to be an issue. It falls at quite a heavy rate as well, especially if you are across the higher terrain, the mainland of Nova Scotia and portions of the Fundy Shores. Miramichi, you saw a very heavy band of rainfall move through. And where Jacqueline has been situated in Charlottetown, I'll zoom this in for you, you could see a little bit of a clearing trend, and that's because the center of Fiona has certainly stretched across eastern Nova Scotia. It's allowed for a little bit of a lull in the precipitation, but not so much when it comes to the wind speeds. Here are some of the clocked in wind speeds over the past 24 hours. Some isolated gusts exceeding 140 kilometers per hour. And a lot of these strong wind gusts will continue to stretch their way into portions of Newfoundland. If you are across Newfoundland, the worst of it will be confined to the western peninsula as well as the South Shore. Think the Burgeo. A lot of these winds, as Jacqueline mentioned earlier on through our live stream coverage, continue to wrap around the circulation of Fiona, or at least what's left with it. So depending on where you are, you're starting to see wind gusts come in at different directions. There's a closer look at Newfoundland. You're starting to see some wind speeds creep up into the 80 to 100 plus kilometer per hour range. And that again is combined to the Wreck House area down towards the Burin. The Avalon still seeing some gusty conditions, but those will gradually ease as we get into tomorrow. We're more concerned about the power outage risk, especially across portions of Nova Scotia. I'll give you a quick update in terms of the current power outages across the region. Nova Scotia, widespread power outages across the region. Nearly 375,000 customers being impacted by this. Almost all of Prince Edward Island without power. New Brunswick, those numbers are also starting to creep up. And Newfoundland, you're last on the list when it comes to the worst of the damage because, again, a lot of the gustiest winds, or at least strongest of those wind gusts, are confined to the southwest. There's an overall risk, the projection in terms of what we're expecting for power outages. Your risk is high to extreme, and that is likely impacting portions of the Gaspé, eastern New Brunswick, portions of eastern Nova Scotia. Again, we've seen a little bit of an onshore progression of Fiona as it pushed over Cape Breton Islands. If you are with us, just tuning in, we continue to live track the impacts associated with Hurricane Fiona, or at least what was once considered Hurricane Fiona. At one point, it did reach Category 4 status. Now it stands at a post-tropical cyclone packing wind speeds of 150 kilometers per hour. The movement, a little bit slower in nature, 43 kilometers per hour. It's traveling to the north. You're probably wondering, where is this hurricane headed next, or at least post-tropical cyclone? It continues its way further north across the Gulf of St. Lawrence and further into portions of Labrador. Kabir, I'm going to loop you in because we've been talking a lot about it's losing its tropical characteristics. I showed the current conditions and it is downright chilly across the Atlantic provinces.
Absolutely. You know what? It's looking at the moment like with that loss of energy, hopefully some of these canceled flights can resume. This was yesterday, taking a look at some cancellation boards at Halifax Airport, and that still was pretty widespread, but as the system makes its way through and over now, hopefully we'll get into seeing some more of these flights starting to resume. Let's talk a little bit though here. Let me go ahead and talk about what we could be expecting in terms of daybreak. Now that day is broken, a lot of the videos that are coming in are showing a very different scene for us. In fact, we're looking at quite a bit of downed trees, power lines, of course. Nathan Coleman was out there clearing out some of the streets himself, which is exciting stuff. But also, if you're out on the streets, don't go ahead and touch any of those power lines because they still are and could be live and pose quite a risk, including a fire risk. So you're going to want to be careful as many of them are still hooked up to the city's power. Now, let's talk a little bit about what we can be expecting in terms of our power outages. Now, I am going to just let my system here listen to me, but it looks like it's not in the mood, so that's okay. 409,000 is currently what our outage map is for Nova Scotia, and that continues to rise actually, especially over the last little while. That was over 409,000, 46,000 rather, 42 actually, that's come down slightly for New Brunswick. And if we take a look now at Nova Scotia, take a look at this here, 410,000. So that number is rising every few moments. And that's being updated live for us as we continue to bring you that. Now, 614 is where it stays right now for Newfoundland. But again, they're a little bit slower to update at the moment. I have been trying to refresh that page because, well, another thing I wanted to point out is as much as it says here, customers, let's talk about that word. As we dig deeper into customers, that has to deal with individual dwellings. And people who pay, of course, the hydro bill doesn't necessarily just mean the number of people is 614. It's usually a larger number than that. As I mentioned, daybreak happening here as we see some of the wind start to calm down. We're looking through the windows and still quite windy, as we can see in those areas. So that's going to be continuing to bring us, hopefully, some of these canceled flights back into circulation. Now I'm going to go ahead and take a look into the flight situation and what cancellations are in place still. The ferries going to Newfoundland are currently suspended, but they will be resuming soon, pending the waters out there. And of course, we've got meteorologist Jesse Uppel, who's going to be around in a few minutes to tell us a bit more about the wave height that we have been expecting and what we have been seeing, if that's going to start to dissipate or if your journey on those shuttles is, or rather those ferries, is going to be rather uncomfortable. We want to make sure, of course, that you do stay safe and comfortable out there on the water. Let's talk also about, well, the track and what we can be expecting for the rest of the weekend. Winds dying down, of course, as we do take a look at the longer range. Now, as of course we take a look at the current power outage situation, as I'd mentioned, those numbers are going to be updated in a moment. So going into our Saturday, that's going to be continuing to make its way northward. And check this out. We're going to see by Sunday afternoon, things are going to start to slow down. Let's go ahead and take a look now at Mark Robinson.
Behind me, the winds are just picking up the ocean and just flinging it up and over.
Okay, and some of the major impacts that we've been really focusing in on when it comes to Fiona have been these 4 major categories. I want to go over them. We've certainly discussed the wind speeds. We've broken wind records for the month of September in several major city centers. Widespread power outages have been a result of these powerful wind speeds wrapping around along across Fiona, and the wind field has been quite expansive, which is why we've seen hundreds of thousands of customers without power. The other one, precipitation. We've seen some heavy amounts of rain starting yesterday across the maritime provinces. The ground has been completely saturated, meaning it's a lot easier for these winds to continue to push damage along any area across city centers or rural areas. Uprooted trees have been one significant aspect of the damage. Flooding has been another issue, especially along coastal areas. And speaking of which, we've also been seeing major storms surge and wave heights. We also have one of our other members from Meteorological Media, Patrick, and he's been out in Quebec. Let's take a look with him. Okay, sorry, one technical issue. That was actually footage from Spain, some of the severe weather that was going through. And, I want to tie that in with some of the hurricanes that we have been seeing. Tornadoes, severe weather cannot be ruled out when we talk about hurricanes, especially when we're still dealing with them over the very warm sea surface temperatures. This is a quick look back at what Fiona did look like on satellite imagery. You could see how it was really densely packed. It had a deep convection, very warm core, and that's exactly why it brought flooding rains and significant damage to portions of the Caribbean islands. You actually contrast that to what it currently looks like over the cooler Atlantic waters. And it's actually incredible to see how it's changed its shape and its form over the Atlantic region. This is actually how it looks like when it enters cooler waters, an area of more shear. And when we talk about shear, meaning a change in wind direction with height above the ground, it allows for the actual hurricane to change its shape and formation, likely just weakening it and allowing for the eye wall to be a little bit less defined. This is where it currently stands post-tropical cyclone Fiona. We continue to track this for you. We've broken several records when it comes to wind, when it comes to pressure. An all-time low September pressure record, we're talking about barometric pressure, was reported in Charlottetown, where our very own Jacqueline Whittle has been reporting live from the field. Significant wave heights as well as storm surge have been an issue across all of the Atlantic shorelines. Let's talk a little bit more about the damage that has been done across Prince Edward Island. Take a look at this.
Okay, so we are up and ready to get back out in the hurricane, and conditions are deteriorating here in PEI. Just want to show you, you can certainly see the winds. Before I went to have a little nap here, just to get some Z's before being up all night. It's 1 o'clock local time AM here. Winds were gusting close to 65, that's it. So I don't know what they're gusting at now. It's certainly intensifying, as it will continue to right through the early morning hours. So stay with us all night long, along with Mark Robinson, Nate Coleman. We're all out here doing our thing, and we can keep you safe. Yeah, these are definitely gusting more than 75 now. It's got to be close, but expecting gusts up to 140 to 150 kilometers an hour here in parts of PEI with what we call a sting jet, part of the jet stream where an enhanced ribbon of air can kind of mix down and increase those winds. So a sting jet around the northern circulation of the storm. So northerly winds, counterclockwise rotation. That's why PEI, particularly Charlottetown, is going to get hit really hard. All right, let's go.
All right, some great insight when it comes to the meteorology behind hurricanes from Jacqueline Whittle. She's one of our storm hunters. We also have Mark Robinson, he has been out in the field all night long, all day yesterday. He is situated in Louisburg, Nova Scotia. We have Nathan Coleman in the city of Halifax reporting on a lot of the storm damage, the storm cleanup, along with the high tide, which is expected to occur a little bit later through the morning hours. We'll continue to keep you posted. We also have Patrick, who is going to be reporting from Quebec with the storm damage as well done across the islands. Let's bring you through the forecast because we've talked a lot about the heavy rainfall pushing through portions of the Maritimes. That has started yesterday, continues this morning. You're probably wondering, when is this rainfall going to let up? Again, we've seen some breaks in the heavy rainfall in Prince Edward Island, even portions of eastern Nova Scotia as well. If you're just tuning in on television, thank you for joining us. If you want the uninterrupted version of our live stream coverage of Fiona, head over to social media, whether that be Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or our Storm Center app online or on desktop. Thank you again for joining us. We continue to track the impacts when it comes to Fiona. The heavy rainfall, it continues across the eastern Maritimes, western Newfoundland this evening, and it actually stretches into cooler air across Labrador, which is very interesting, a very interesting aspect of this because it has been allowing for some snowfall to develop, or at least it will continue into our Sunday. Some heavier pockets of snow likely over the higher elevations of Labrador, which is something we don't see too often. Something else we don't see too often, a pressure record for an all-time low pressure ever recorded in Canada. That occurred earlier this morning over Hart Island, Nova Scotia. Again, we continue to monitor the very gusty winds because when we talk about low pressure, especially to that intensity, we talk about the damaging wind aspect. And that has certainly been the case where Mark Robinson has been in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, eastern sections of Nova Scotia in particular. The winds continue to be quite strong across all coastal areas of the Maritime provinces this afternoon. So expect power outages to continue right through this weekend. And actually this coming out from the National Hurricane Center, what we're expecting when it comes to tropical force wind speeds, that's 63 kilometers per hour or greater. These are sustained wind gusts. So these are not isolated wind gusts in nature. They're actually quite steady, and they are capable of producing widespread damage to the area. When it comes to what we have been seeing across the area, we've clocked in wind speeds in excess of 140 kilometers per hour. We beat several records. And if you are really into the stats behind weather, you're going to love this. I mean, it did do significant damage, but a very neat meteorology tie-in here is that we actually clocked in the second windiest September day in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, where our very own Jacqueline Whittle is. And this, again, comes right after Juan. And if you are, again, familiar with Juan or maybe familiar with Dorian or some of the previous hurricanes and tropical cyclones to push through the Atlantic provinces, this has stacked up to be quite the historic storm. Fiona still impacting parts of the Maritimes with very heavy rainfall. That's expected to continue. We've had some rainfall warnings being issued and dropping off. They still are in place for areas inclusive of Halifax, Sydney, Nova Scotia, Charlottetown, up towards the Gaspé as well. Those are creeping into portions of southwest Newfoundland and the winds still very widespread. We've been talking a lot about the widespread wind damage and the storm cleanup. That is going to be a concern well into this weekend. Unfortunately, the cleanup continues, and we will touch base with all of our team field members very shortly. But what we have been seeing, I'll recap very quickly for anyone just joining us. Hurricane Fiona, or at least what was once Hurricane Fiona, has entered some cooler ocean waters, and then that has essentially weakened it ever so slightly. It's been allowing for some of the winds to diminish depending on where you are. If you are across parts of Halifax, you've been dealing with several power outages. So we're going to be giving you some tips. Have a look at this.
Most power outages only last a few minutes, but some of them, like the ones caused by freezing rain or high winds, can last longer because they can damage power lines. Here's how you can plan ahead. Pack an emergency kit. Stock it with battery or wind-up light sources, candles and matches, lots of water, canned and dry foods, batteries, a first aid kit, and medical supplies for your family and pets. The general rule is to make sure you have enough medication to last 3 days, and reserve about 2 liters of water for each person per day. During a power outage, first check if the issue is limited to your home. If it is, check your circuit breaker or fuse box. If it isn't, contact your electric service provider. Do not approach any broken or damaged power lines or wires. Turning off all electrical appliances, lights, and tools in your home prevents surge damage when power is restored. Keep your freezer and fridge closed. A full freezer can keep food frozen up to 36 hours after an outage if the door is tightly closed, according to the Government of Canada. One important thing to remember: never ever use charcoal or gas barbecues, camping heating equipment, or home generators indoors or in any enclosed space. These can give off carbon monoxide, which you can't smell or see, and carbon monoxide poisoning can cause life-threatening injuries.
All right, some great tips to keep in mind, especially in your back pocket when you are dealing with power outages. We are no stranger to power outages across the Atlantic region, especially when it comes to the impacts associated with Fiona. I want to show you the scope of this hurricane, this tropical cyclone, because it's been quite expansive. We've seen major impacts stretch from western portions of Bermuda out towards our neck of the woods, across the maritime provinces, across southern Newfoundland, in excess of 11 meters high. These have been the wave heights being reported across the Atlantic basin. And actually, in some areas, a little bit further out to sea, we've seen some wind speeds whip up those waves and allow for 14-meter high waves in some areas. These have been rocking boats. We have incredible footage to show you as well of the waves, of the storm surge. Again, several areas, including the city of Halifax, Sydney, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Charlottetown in particular, have been under a storm surge warning. We're really concerned about coastal areas at this time. And that's because of how Fiona has tracked over the region. So if you are anywhere in the magenta that you're seeing on your screen, or maroon rather, you are under a storm surge warning, meaning you need to seek shelter. You want to stay away from coastal areas in particular within this warning zone. We also have very heavy amounts of rain in the forecast continuing through tomorrow. How much? In excess of 150 millimeters of rainfall. Again, we know the nature of tropical storms. They grab onto a whole lot of moisture, and they move some significant waves onshore as well, creating lots of damage. This is where post-tropical cyclone Fiona currently stands. Again, it's been moving over eastern Nova Scotia, where we have been seeing the brunt of the power outages as well as the damage. Some of the damage coming out of the city of Halifax, quite significant as well. There's been several trees down, uprooted. Nathan was reported as well. This photo has actually been taken by our very own Nathan Coleman in the streets of Halifax. And again, it's because of the very gusty winds along with the very heavy rainfall that has been falling. In terms of the rainfall, that is going to continue to be an issue, and we'll continue to track this storm for you, because right through this afternoon and evening, we'll likely pick up again another round of very heavy rainfall for eastern Nova Scotia and western Newfoundland. Snowfall is in the forecast. We'll talk a little bit more about that in long-range forecast continuing into our Sunday. Quite interesting. It's not every day that you see cold weather being associated with post-tropical cyclones. It's wrapping in some very cold air behind it. Speaking of cold air, I want to give you a quick glimpse of the current conditions because we have our team members on standby. We'll touch base with them in a few seconds, but our temperatures are going to be in the low single digits or maybe just barely scraping that 10-degree mark. We have Patrick in the field as well as Mark Robinson. It's incredibly windy where both of you are. Patrick, I'm going to throw it over to you to talk about the current conditions where you are located.
Well, I don't know if you can hear me right now.
Yeah, we got you.
We're at the Magdalen Islands, the southern part of the islands. This is where it's really being battered as we speak. We're recording winds over 130 kilometers an hour easily, but also the low pressure. The pressure is so low that the sea is rising very, very high. Yesterday we were here and the sea was about 2 meters or 3 meters less than it is now. And as you can see, it's almost to this level right now. This boat is really being battered also. The conditions are so bad that where we are, we're kind of stuck because the road's been flooded. We're just gonna be stuck because of the situation. The biggest gust that was recorded is 132 kilometers an hour on the Magdalen Island, and is the same as the all-time record. So probably that we're going to break that record. Already we have unofficially broken the lowest pressure in Canada. So Fiona's a big one. It's a strong one. If you don't have to get out and you're in the Maritimes, don't. Just watch us on TV. It's worth it.
Yeah, staying dry in the studio is quite the blessing. Thank you so much, Patrick. Stay away from the coastlines. I know the boats have been rocking, and Mark, the visuals coming out of the Quebec Islands, quite impressive, and it's going to be a historic storm. It already has been proving itself to be a historic storm. Mark, you've been reporting a lot about on the damage being done in eastern Nova Scotia, particularly in Louisburg. The winds, it looks like the winds have been picking up again where you are. Let's talk a lot about that.
Yeah, that is one way to put it, Jesse. The winds have definitely picked up again. We're down at the pier here, and I can tell you the winds have just been absolutely incredible as the sun has come up, so we can actually see what's going on. These winds are doing damage to the town, unfortunately. We've seen multiple buildings with structural damage. Right here, I wanted to give you an idea of how strong the winds are, and I'm actually relatively safe here because that's the ocean right there. You can see beside me right here, that's the storm surge that has kept coming in, and it's sort of pushed up the road here. We're very safe where we are. We can get out if the storm surge does come in. Now, what I'm expecting is these winds to begin to ramp down, but you're still going to get these incredible gusts. Now, we're registering at well over 100 kilometers an hour here, but yeah, you can kind of see I can actually lean back into the wind right here and just sort of be on an angle. That's the kind of strength that these winds have, and these are the strongest I have felt in any part of the storm by far. It's absolutely incredible to feel this power of storm in Nova Scotia. These are the kind of winds I often experience in the hurricanes down south. So we're talking about the Gulf Coast, Florida, and yet these winds are now visiting Nova Scotia with this unprecedented storm, and it is not over yet. When it does come on shore and really start to go north, it will break down fairly quickly. But as I said, you're still going to have these kinds of gusts with this storm, even as it begins to die down.
Wow, absolutely incredible, Mark. I mean, you're kind of terrifying me when you're leaning back on the wind. Is it completely bone chilling, or does it feel somewhat tropical still? Because it's been traveling over extremely cooler waters across the Atlantic, inching closer to eastern Nova Scotia. I'm showing everyone the temperatures is about 11 or 12 degrees where you are, a little bit cooler and wetter near the coastlines where you're situated. But how does the actual air feel? We know you're getting blown away, but is it a very cold wind, or is it a little bit still tropical-like?
Yeah, it's definitely, Jesse, it's really hard to hear you, so I'm hoping that what you're asking is how cold is the wind. The wind is relatively cold, but it's not quite as bad as obviously a winter storm. Definitely not as warm as a tropical hurricane down in Florida, but here, holy cow, like if there was anything upstream of me, I would be very, like I would not do this. The only reason I'm doing this is that I know that there's nothing, I can't be hit by any debris because there's nothing over there. I know that we can get away from the surge before it comes in. We've got enough time, but these winds, Jesse, it's just unbelievable. I haven't felt anything like this since Hurricane Michael.
That's
and I was
incredible.
not expecting it to be this strong. It's just, I'm just floored by this storm.
Wow, and
Like,
Mark, there's
from a
been quite the
meteorological point of
difference.
view, it's fascinating to watch.
Yeah, and just in the course of a couple of minutes, you can see where the storm surge is really starting to push through. The winds are really reaching peak intensity. We've already seen record-breaking winds across eastern Nova Scotia, several power outages. Again, Mark, I want to dive into a little bit of the safety impacts because you obviously are a very experienced storm chaser. You've been down south, you've been through nor'easters, you've been through hurricanes. What can you tell the general public when it comes to safety and these types of storms?
One real quick rule: don't do what Mark does. I mean, I'm taking, like this is definitely not completely safe, but at the same time, I'm taking all the steps I can to mitigate the risk. I've actually got a helmet on here. I have to wear that just for debris. I have, multiple layers of clothing to keep myself warm because that can be very hard on you. And then I also, as I said, I know that there's nothing upstream of me other than essentially water, so it's not as big a deal with the flying debris. Going back to our hotel, we have to go down the street. That's actually one of the things I just don't want people to be doing because you are getting these buildings coming apart, and they'll come apart all of a sudden, you won't know, and all of a sudden you're getting hit by debris. I have seen some people driving around, fishermen want to check out what how their boats are doing. I saw one of them drive into the storm surge and then make the wise decision. They made the very wise decision to say, you know what, nope, we're going, and they left. Oh, wow. The wind and the spray feels like needles, like I'm getting
Absolutely
I hope you
incredible.
can still hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you, Mark.
Still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Again, I'm trying to get back into position. I apologize for that. It basically, once you start going, you almost can't stop. So as I was saying, they got into the storm surge here, turned around, and went back home. There's absolutely nothing they can do to do anything about the boats in this kind of weather. A boat can be replaced. A building can be replaced. You can't be. So
Absolutely, Mark.
This is the kind of situation that you just want to stay inside, hunker down, and don't come out. This is why, and this is why I'm out here, to show you why going out here is incredibly dangerous.
Yes, and that's coming from the most experienced storm chaser. Also, alongside Mark, we have Jacqueline. Jacqueline, the footage coming in from Louisburg, Nova Scotia, absolutely significant in nature, significant storm surge coming in, just really flowing through that area. Let's talk about the storm damage where you are in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. It's very different. When you compare what Mark has been going through with the winds and the storm surge and the flooding, it's quite different where you are, but there's still a lot of damage in Prince Edward Island. Let's talk about where you are, Jacqueline.
Yes, Jesse, we are stationed right downtown in a kind of a residential area here in Charlottetown, and the scene is quite dismal. There's a lot of trees down, a lot of tree shreds, so tree branches and limbs, but then actual uprooted trees. I've seen the same kind of images coming out of Halifax. Nate Coleman, of course, shooting a lot of that, and you've probably seen that as well. You know, there's wires down on this road where some parts of the road are impassable, and you know, this is our job. We're out here to report this and show you what we're seeing to help keep you safe, but it's recommended that locals stay off the roads because of what we see behind me here, Jesse. You can see this power line, this pole could come down really at any time, and there's wires, probably more like telephone wires, my cameraman thinks, rather than actual hydro wires. Hard to say though whether they're live or not. And then look at that tree. That is a massive tree. I'm not sure what kind, but some of those limbs, I mean, that's a lot of weight. If that had come down on a house, that could have ended very badly, potentially fatally for people, you know, and obviously you can see the force of it behind me that's just completely uprooted. Everything is so saturated from the rain that even with the winds that we have now, although things have subsided, you know, we're still seeing stuff come down, stuff being blown around. Just a second ago, I saw a piece of debris come flying and I lost my hat. Like, you just all of a sudden get an unexpected gust.
Absolutely, and we talk about wind gusts and the difference between sustained winds. Even when your sustained winds come down, Jacqueline, if the ground is so saturated, those winds are still strong enough to uproot more trees. So we're not expecting a lot of this to really diminish anytime soon, unfortunately. I mean, the tree behind you, the power line, the post behind you, it puts things in perspective of how strong these winds really are. And we talk about, say, a Category 1 strength storm striking the region of wind speeds of upwards of 150 kilometers per hour. We've certainly seen winds in excess of that, especially when it comes to wind gusts in the area. Let's talk a little bit more about what you've been seeing. Have you been seeing a lot of people take shelter in your area? Have you been seeing residents outdoors or doing the safe thing to stay indoors?
I've seen nobody on the streets yet, which is a good thing. So everybody that lives here, good work. Stay off the roads. Let us professionals like us that are weather reporters and meteorologists or police officials, emergency officials do their job to keep you safe. Let us give you the updates so you know, so that you don't have to drive around in a very dangerous situation still. And like you say, even though it's ramping down, and it is, and we've got a bit of a break from the rain, so I think it's just natural. It's like Christmas morning when you just want to get down and take a look under the tree. Right now it's like you want to get outside, you want to see how bad it is. What did the storm do? You know what? The damage isn't going anywhere. It's going to be around for all day. So let things calm down a bit. People can get out and assess what they need to assess. Like I said, this is like what we see behind me here, Jesse. It's endless like this, like tons of uprooted trees. I haven't seen any that have landed on a car. Well, I have seen one that landed on a car. Nobody was in the car, but it was parked overnight. I haven't seen any trees that have landed on any houses yet, which is good, but I won't rule that out yet. We're going to do a full damage survey of Charlottetown PEI. But yeah, lots to unfold here as we get into daylight, Jesse.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jacqueline. We also are joined by Mark Robinson. He is under major winds and storm surge just flowing under his feet. Water has been just flowing across the streets in Louisburg, Nova Scotia. Mark is really weathering this storm. I mean, this is such a dangerous situation. You do not want to be driving in this. If you are a resident, if you are not an experienced storm chaser, you do not want to be out in this. I want to remind everyone that Mark Robinson is in the proper gear. He's wearing a helmet. He knows exactly where he's situated in a safer, quote unquote, place in eastern Nova Scotia. Mark, let's talk about the damage. Compare it to portions of Prince Edward Island, where Jacqueline has been seeing major uprooted trees, down power lines, but the storm damage that comes with storm surge is quite different.
Yeah, definitely. We are seeing some storm surge. This is what this water is right here. It's coming on shore and sort of making its way up the road here. Now, I haven't seen it come much beyond where it is at this point, which tells me we're likely sort of at the height of what the storm surge will do. So I think that's going to be good lot of people in and around this area, because that way, if it's not coming up too much, we're not going to see that much flooding, at least down in this dock area. Now, I can't speak for all the different low-lying areas in and around Louisburg, simply because we can't see them, we can't get to them. So I can speak to the docks. Yes, right now the water is not flooding, say, the Coast Guard areas here, but there's definitely flooding the pier and the docks. And that, so trying to come down to check out your boat, your fishing boat, please don't. You can't get up onto there because of this storm surge, and you can see it actually comes back up again. So like, watch, there's that wave which pushes it up. Now, as I said though, it's not going beyond what we've seen it in the last, say, about hour. It hasn't come up anymore. So I do I anticipate that might be the peak for the storm surge. When you have the peak of the storm surge, it also means you're likely peaking with the winds as well. But this storm, this is something very different than a lot of storms that come through Nova Scotia to the Maritime, because this one came in perpendicular to Nova Scotia and actually slowed down a little bit. And that's a little bit unusual, because quite often they go past, they're through, 3 hours later the whole thing's done. This is something unprecedented for me. I've never been in hurricane winds for this long in this area of Canada, this area of the world even. So that, I think, is the big difference. How the buildings are holding up, I'm actually impressed. I'm very impressed that a lot of buildings are holding up quite well. You can see, there is shingling or there's siding coming off of the building here. I can see that. But again, if it does come off, that debris is going that way. I'm pretty much safe. Everything looks good on that. Water over there. Not giant waves coming here, so that's good. A lot of these buildings, as I was saying, a lot of the buildings are holding together. I have seen some power lines down, and lots of trees down. And when those trees come down the power lines, it's going to take a while to get them all fixed, because it may be, you may be in an area where you're saying, oh, it's not bad now. This is the kind of situation that you just can't get any work done. So we have to let the hydro workers get out there and do their work to get everything dealt with. But just imagine how many thousands of trees are down over the line. So be patient, please. People are going to get out and try and get that power back on, but it's going to take a while, because you're still dealing with conditions like this in places like Louisburg.
Wow, Mark from Louisburg, just incredible footage. The storm surge, the water flowing through the streets of eastern Nova Scotia. Jacqueline, I want to loop you back in and talk about the storm damage when it comes to not only where you're situated, but also the elevation, because we talk a lot about elevation dependency. You're from British Columbia, you know a whole lot about elevation dependency when it comes to weather systems, whether that means rainfall enhancement or more storm surge. What can you comment on when it comes to the elevation where you're located, and does it help or does it not help when it comes to storm damage?
Excellent question. I don't profess to be an expert here in Charlottetown, PEI, or really the whole island per se, but what I can tell you is that most of this island, for anyone that doesn't live here, it's relatively flat. I don't know exactly the elevation here to a T, but I mean, there's not a lot of topography to start to enhance, rainfall amounts or really any, down or upsloping winds that I can imagine happening here. What I can tell you, though, is that where Charlottetown is positioned on the island, and anyone local here knows exactly what I'm talking about, it's all about the direction of the winds, and it's all about the angle at which the hurricane or any, nor'easter or anything is hitting the island, and that goes for Nova Scotia and Cape Breton and Newfoundland too. But what I mean by that is when Juan came in, we had a predominantly southerly flow. Well, that then piled up that water, and storm surge became a big threat on the southern part of the island where Charlottetown is. This time, it's very different. We've had a northerly wind. We've got that wraparound wind around the circulation, which I'm sure you've been showing all the time on air around the radar. but because of that, it actually kind of protects Charlottetown from things like surge and even things like just, even the heavy rain. Like there's no real topography to enhance that I can tell. Maybe a local might say otherwise. But yes, I think Charlottetown certainly got the brunt of the winds because, well, there's a factor. There is no topography to slow down those winds. Let's say that. Because it is so flat, you've got nothing in its way to really slow that down. And it's such a small island that it doesn't really slow much of anything down. So Charlottetown, gusted out over 130 kilometers an hour. Quite impressive. So yeah, but I mean, learning a lot while I'm here, and I think that's the best thing about covering these storms and all kinds of different storm setups in different locations across the country, Jesse, is that you always take something away from each storm, and that helps you on the next storm, and you learn from that, and hopefully that helps our viewers. Jesse?
Absolutely. And again, I want to remind everyone, you're an extremely experienced storm chaser. You've been down south chasing hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, parts of Florida as well. So, I mean, the difference between something like this hitting Atlantic Canada versus across the Gulf states, Mark mentioned, it's quite incredible that these winds can actually reach all the way into parts of Canada to this degree. And we've broken lots of records. I actually just checked the elevation in Charlottetown. Quite low. It's about 49 meters to sea level. So again, relatively flat. Not doing too much to enhance rainfall or snowfall amounts there because, I mean, it's incredibly wide open and flat. But I do want to ask you one question, Jacqueline. What would you compare this storm to versus something you've chased down south across the United States?
That's a super easy question for me to answer. I go right to Hurricane Florence. I think it was 2018 or 19, Florence. Can you remember? My cameraman was with me, but we can't remember the exact year. But Hurricane Florence was a storm that hit Wilmington, North Carolina. And it was so similar to this one because at no point really have more than Cat 2 winds with that hurricane landfall, but it just stalled, and it stalled with Cat 1 winds for a prolonged period of time. And Wilmington is very charming, an East Coast city, kind of like Charlottetown or many of the towns across the Maritimes here, where, it's those old wooden structures, those colored buildings, that are each is a different color, and just this real charming feel with a lot of old trees. And that's what this reminds me of. It reminds me of Hurricane Florence. And unfortunately, it was heartbreaking to see all the tree damage in that storm, and it's beginning to look that way here.
Okay, thank you so much for the update, Jacqueline. Great to put things in perspective for all of our viewers watching from home. Hopefully staying safe. I want you to take a break, get dry, get a little bit of a rest before we touch base with you very shortly, Jacqueline.
Sounds good,
All
Jesse.
right. Thank you so much. Our Storm Center coverage continues. We've been talking a lot about the wind speeds packing in across portions of Atlantic Canada. I want to actually give you some of these numbers and put them into perspective for you. If you're just joining us on television, thank you so much. We continue our live stream program when it comes to all things Fiona. It was, at least in one point in time, a Category 4 hurricane. What does that mean when it comes to the wind speeds? Likely between that 209 to 251 kilometers per hour. That can cause catastrophic damage. And we've already seen some Category 1, Category 2 wind speeds being pushed up into portions of Atlantic Canada. But we also have one of our other team field members out in Quebec. That is Patrick, and he has been out battling the winds. He's been dealing with significant storm surge, significant wave heights as well. Currently under a storm surge warning, rainfall warning as well. Several areas across Atlantic Canada, wind warnings blanket all of the Southern Maritimes and all of Prince Edward Island. We also give you the update of power outages because these winds, coupled with the very saturated grounds, have resulted in significant damage and widespread power outages. Nearly 377,000 customers without power, and we continue to update you when it comes to that. In terms of the rainfall started yesterday across the Maritime provinces. We're starting to see some breaks in the heavy rainfall. I'll zoom in here for you across portions of Cape Breton as well as Prince Edward Island, but that continues to be wrapping around the center of circulation, especially when it comes to what's left of post-tropical cyclone Fiona. Let's tap into our field reporter, Patrick. He's in Quebec, across the islands, which have, again, pushed in very dangerous surf, significant storm surge, and gusty winds. Patrick, what can you tell us? I see a lot of emergency crews behind you.
Yeah, emergency crews are out this morning, trying basically to stop people from using these streets and these roads because they've been flooded. On this side, this is where the sea is, and because of the rising sea and the storm waves, all of these houses are now flooded, basically. But so that's why the emergency vehicles are here. It's still very windy. I got this big house right here, which stops a bit of the wind, so I'm not it's not as windy as it was before, but I want you guys to cross the street with me. On the other side, there's something very interesting that's very typical from the Magdalen Islands. They have, see right now, I'm really a lot more in the wind. They have a huge erosion problem here. They're losing pieces of land every time there's a storm like this. So they made these rock banks to stop the sea from coming over. That's why on this side, you can see the houses, they're not wet, they're not in the water, but there's no rock banks on that side. So that's why all these other houses have been flooded, are still are underwater, I'm sorry. So I have to admit, and Jackie and Mark knows about this because we've covered hurricane a few times together, and this is one of the top ones I've ever been in. Not only wind speed is really strong, but the flooding that started really almost instantly. And it's not flooding from the rain, it's basically flooding from the sea rise, the storm surge that really happened within, I'd say within 30 minutes, within an hour, everything was dry, and then suddenly everything is flooded, as you can see it right now. This part of the island is the southern part of the island, and there's a lot of restaurants, and it's a very beachy area where tourists come a lot. It's the place that was closed first yesterday. They shut down all these little stores and all these restaurants that are here because it's very touristy. And as you can see, they're gonna need a pretty good mop when all this is when this is over, because there's a lot of water everywhere.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Patrick. Again, one of the major aspects that you've been talking about is the flooding because of the waves and the storm surge. And actually what I'm looking at right now are some of the current, or at least estimated, wave heights in your area. And they range between 6 to maybe up to 9 meters in height. And that is very significant, and it puts things in perspective, especially where you are situated, of the water just rushing on shore. And again, those houses on that side of the island just not protected at all. When are you expecting to see a little bit of an improvement when it comes to these weather conditions?
One of the funny things, I don't know if you can still hear me, but one of the funny things is that yesterday, the people living in these islands, we were going around trying to talk to them, say, how do you prepare to this? And they were telling us, we already know where we're going to go tomorrow to watch the storm, because we know these islands very well, and the storm's going to be very bad in this place. So this is why we got here this morning, because yesterday they were telling us this is where it's going to happen. And they were right. These people really know the weather and the sea and the island. So yeah, they were right. Basically, it's exactly flooded, and it's the storm we predicted.
Yes, absolutely. It's the historic storm that we've been closely tracking all through the week. Patrick, one last question for you. Were you actually expecting this many records to be broken when it comes to the wind speeds, when it comes to the pressure drop?
I have to say that no, I did not. In the sense that, yes, we get hurricanes, but usually very weak hurricanes. Right now, the Atlantic water is so hot that Fiona, just like any hurricane that would have gone by there, kept its strength. And even when it got into Canadian water, it still was very, very strong. So I was thinking that maybe it would lose some strength, especially when Niai hit Cape Breton. I thought the island being a mountain, I thought it would really stop it or at least weaken it a little. But basically, that's not what happened. Au contraire, as we say in French, it got really, really bad, even on the other side here in the Magdalen Island, which is hundreds of kilometers from Cape Breton.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the size of Fiona has been incredible. It stretched, I mean, if you match the distance or at least the diameter of this cyclone to the size of land over Atlantic, it stretches from Yarmouth further to the city of St. John. So because it's so big in nature, it's been sitting over very warm waters for quite some time, which, I mean, it ties into exactly what you've been saying, Patrick. It has maintained its strength, and it did catch a lot of people off guard, but luckily we've been under several hurricane warnings and tropical cyclone watches across the region.
I'm sorry, I think I lost you. But you were talking about the size of the storm, and you're so right, because you can just imagine that under the storm, it's like with a straw. When you're pumping from the glass, the water comes up because you're lowering the pressure in the straw. Well, it's the same thing. The storm is has such a low pressure that the water rises underneath. But now you imagine that thing is 400 kilometers wide, so you got a 400 kilometer storm surge underneath, and all of this is moving with the storm on land. So basically, this is what happens. Okay, so as you can see, it's still a very risky conditions. We do see people sometimes that comes around. I think they're just come to look around because they heard on the radio or something that it was flooded or stuff like that. We have one man right there. But maybe we can come this way, Patrice. Come with me. I want you to see these rock banks that they've made to protect their shores, because every time there's a storm, they lose a lot of their shores. If we can manage to get on top, come with me. So you see, it's made out of these. I'm not gonna say pebbles. I'm just gonna say little rocks, but they spend millions and millions of dollars every year just to make these embankments and to rise these embankments, because every time there's a storm, some of these rocks are washed away. So they have to fill them back up in order to make sure that this side stays dry. Now, as you can see, the water is very choppy on this side, but it's going against these rock banks. That's why these houses are not wet. But on this side, there is no rock banks. So that's why the sea managed to rise and basically flood all these houses. We can also come with me, Patrice.
Wow, it's actually incredible, Patrick. Sorry, I'm back.
Great work of my cameraman.
Great work. I mean, it ties into the overall geography of where you're situated, because, I mean, this is an area that is notorious for very powerful storms. So, again, the track of several storms takes a similar track, rather, across this region. So, it's great to see that this area is doing something to better equip themselves for next storms on tap.
Of course, it's a it's one of the most touristy region of the province of Quebec. There's a lot, there's thousands and thousands of people that comes every summer here. So, and these people, I have to say, because I've met many of them, are so proud. They just don't want to lose their island, and they're really happy to see us when all these tourists come in. So they do make these embankments, and they do take measures to make sure that the island is not going to be eroding completely. But look on this side. See, on this side, there's no embankment. It just gives you an idea. All of the island, all the shores of the island are made that way. You can see on this side too. Look at these houses. Look how close these houses are from the sea. If they don't make these rock embankments, it's definitely going to be washed out either from this storm or the next storm. So that's why they do it that way. And then it kind of takes away the lovely look, but it makes them stay alive.
Yes, and safety comes first for sure. What can you comment on when it comes to flights and transportation in and out of the islands? Because I know these weather conditions are quite significant when it comes to the flooding, the storm surge, the winds. Have there been any complete cancellations or evacuations even in this area?
They did not evacuate. They told me that they see storms often, that they're not scared. They did not evacuate. Now, the only way to come on this island is through the ferry. It's a 6-hour ferry ride between where you are on Prince Edward Island, actually the eastern portion of Prince Edward Island, the city called Surrey. It's about 6 hours from there to here on the boat. Of course, yesterday there was the last day because let me explain this way. There's a boat leaving here every day at 8 in the morning. It makes it to Surrey at about 1 in the afternoon. Then at 2 in the afternoon, one comes from Surrey back here, and that's all there is for the day. Yesterday, because they wanted to keep the ferry open, they moved the schedule a little bit. They moved earlier so they wouldn't go through such choppy waters. But they already knew that today there was not going to be any ferry. Now, the tourist season is slowly going down, which means that usually they have a ferry every day. Starting this weekend, they're going to be a ferry only 5 days a week. And by the time we're in the middle of winter, it's only 1 or 2 days a week.
Okay, that's great to know. I mean, it sounds like they're well aware of the weather hitting the area. Let's talk a little bit about winter weather, Patrick. I don't want to get ahead of myself and talk about the snow, but we've been seeing this post-tropical cyclone encounter some colder air. And there's a little bit of snow in the forecast across Labrador, which is interesting. There's enough cold air to tap into. But for this area in particular, where you are situated across the islands, I mean, this is notorious for seeing nor'easters. Have you yourself been in nor'easters, and how does this storm compare to, say, a nor'easter hitting Atlantic Canada?
I was talking with these people a little earlier yesterday, and they were explaining to me that one of the biggest reasons why they have to do these rock banks is because there's no more winter. The ice doesn't form anymore around the island, so because the winter storms are much stronger, the wave really hit the banks and the shores a lot more in the winter because they're not protected by the natural ice that would usually form. So, and that's typically climate change. I mean, let's be blunt about it. So basically, because the winter storms are now hitting the shores a lot more, plus the nor'easter that you were talking about, the coastal systems, well, now they have to really do this if they want to save big parts of their island. Because yesterday I was on another part of the island where they did this type of dams, and I went to the side of the coast, and when you touch it, it's basically sand that's packed with water. It just breaks so easily. So you can just imagine wave and winds this strength, what effect it would have on the shores. But yeah, they say they lost the winter. They are hit a lot more in the storms in the winter. The nor'easter really hits them too, and the hurricane like we have right now also is a big problem. So they're doing everything trying to basically save their culture and their island.
Yeah, that's beautiful to hear. Patrick, what would you compare this to? What would you compare being in Fiona to when it comes to hurricanes? Have you tracked a very similar hurricane, or have you been reminded of something on recent memory that you have chased yourself in the field?
I have to admit that one of the biggest hurricane I ever went into was Michael in 2018. We were in a parking lot, a cement parking lot in Florida, in the panhandle of Florida. And for a few hours, we had around us almost 200 kilometers an hour wind. But right next to us, there was another little town, because of course, when we go in a storm like this, it's kind of a thrill to try to make it to the eye, but it's very, very difficult. So we weren't exactly in the eye, we were in the eye wall. That's why we had 200 kilometers an hour wind for a few hours. But we were protected, don't worry, we never put ourselves in danger. But right next to us, there was a city called Mexico Beach. And Mexico Beach, because of the storm surge, I saw 8 to 10 house blocks, streets and everything completely washed into the lagoon in the back. There was one house that was standing up after the hurricane, and when we asked the people how come that house stood, and they went, that's the guy who built his house to be hurricane proof, and he tried to convince the other to do the same, and he did not manage to convince them, but he was there, still the only one standing.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, we could all take notes for that if you are living in a storm-prone area like that. It's a great idea to be well equipped, to be protected for future storms, because that is certainly going to be the case moving forward. That's just the nature of weather. We can go forward. I mean, thank you so much for your insights, Patrick. You've really highlighted some of the major impacts. Thank you so much. We'll be tapping into a little bit later on through the live stream. So thank you so much. Get some rest, get a little bit of a break, dry up. Thank you so much from Quebec. Let's get right into your weather forecast. We've, again, been live streaming this Fiona impacts for you across Atlantic Canada through our live stream coverage. If you're watching on our desktop, on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, thank you so much. Please send in your questions, whatever they happen to be and wherever you happen to be situated across the region, because we can go live with you anytime and answer those questions for you in real time. A walk through satellite imagery and radar. A lot of the heavy rain falling across portions of Nova Scotia. You could see the cloud deck stretching further across Newfoundland. If you are across the city of St. John's, Gander, eastern Newfoundland, you're starting to see some spotty showers, some light rain, and maybe some high cloud cover, but really nothing to the degree of the intense winds we've been clocking in across the maritime provinces. Currently stands at post-tropical cyclone, Category 1 wind speeds, 150 kilometers per hour. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to Fiona, because it's been breaking records, whether it is the wind speeds, the wind gusts, or the central pressure. And it continues to maintain its strength. If you're wondering, hey, when is this post-tropical cyclone expected to weaken? Well, you know what? This projected track continues to maintain wind speeds of close over 100 to 130 kilometers per hour right through the day today into the afternoon. If you're wondering what did it look like once upon a time, this is a look back at Fiona when it was currently making landfall, or at least was making landfall in Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic. If you're just tuning in on our television channel, thank you so much for joining in. If you want the uninterrupted version of our live stream coverage, head over to our desktop on our app. Storm Center coverage continues on all social media platforms as well. We're tracking the remnants of Fiona. This was the very first major hurricane of the Atlantic season. And you're probably wondering, what other storms are brewing? Well, we actually clocked in a few more following Fiona, that being Gaston, which was well out to sea across the Atlantic. And we're also keeping a close eye out on the impacts that Ian might actually pose in parts of the Caribbean as well as Florida. So let's quickly dissect that and then get back to your Fiona coverage, because this is going to be likely something that makes national headlines later into next week. It's currently a tropical storm. I'll bring you through the projected track of this, because it will likely make landfall somewhere across western Cuba, unfortunately, by early next week. And then by the end of next week, potentially pushing into portions of Florida. And again, we've been talking a lot about hurricane development. We've just reached the peak of hurricane season back on September 10th, meaning through the month of September, we typically see about 40% of tropical cyclone activity. It was a slow start to the season, but you know what? Things are ramping up. Temperatures across the ocean waters are incredibly warm at this time of year. This is what Colorado State University is forecasting going forward, 20 named storms of the hurricane season. That's what we're expecting. The average is about 14 versus the 20 that we're forecasting. I want to loop back in Mark Robinson and Jacqueline Whittle. Mark Robinson in Louisburg, Nova Scotia, Jacqueline Whittle in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. It looks like the winds are still howling where you are. There's a little bit of storm surge, water flowing through the streets where Jacqueline is in Charlottetown. Let's go to you, Jacqueline, first, because I've seen a lot of movement and change in the weather conditions where you are. Let's talk about what's currently happening.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, last time we spoke, it was like a lull in the storm, and it's really ramped up, Jesse. I think what's happening, without even looking on radar, I'm going to guess that some of these feeder bands are coming in. Some of these squalls are bringing in some really gusty winds and some more rain. It is actually hard to even talk right now because the rain is stinging me right in the eye. My cameraman is probably getting rocked around here too. But let's take you here. I actually think this might be more of a flooding from rainfall, Jesse, and that is maybe ponding and pooling in this area. You can see here, I'm going to just kind of walk through some of these floodwaters a little bit and talk to it. You've got a lot of tree shred, you've got a lot of branches, you've got, you got to be careful making sure that storm drains are open so that this can start to drain away. But this whole street here is completely flooded out. And what's interesting about this was our first area that we saw a tree actually fall on a house. So if anybody happened to be riding out this storm in that upper level, that could have been very dangerous at that time. You can see it's actually gone right through the trusses of the roof system. It's completely toppled over. It didn't actually go through it went through part of the roof, I guess, now that I look at that, but could have been worse. That's the first tree we've actually seen that's fallen on a home that we've seen. But anyway, the winds are really ramping up here, as you can see. I think it's a reminder that this is a long duration event and conditions are changing, as you say. So more rain and more strong winds expected. Jesse?
Yes, and you know what, to tie in, a lot of the reason why we're seeing so much ponding and pooling on the roads is not only because of the heavy rain, but it's also the winds driving a lot of the storm surge on shore. Let's talk about more storm surge and storm damage in Louisburg, Nova Scotia with Mark. Mark, you have new gear on. You still have your helmet on, which is great. You're staying safe. Let's talk about the current conditions, because I still see a lot of that water being whipped on shore.
Yeah, Jesse, this is unbelievable. I expected this to be well finished because of the speed at which it was coming in, and it is still just roaring down here. I've been getting gusts very close to 100 kilometers an hour, and it's probably well over 100. You know, the anemometer that I've got, this one here, it's just a handheld one. It tends to measure about 20% below what the actual wind speeds are. But I want to show you what that wind is driving. If you look behind me here, you can see the waves just crashing on shore. And there's just big rock barriers right here to try and make sure that there isn't too much erosion. And even then, you do see some of these rocks get moved. I'm watching storm surge come up all around, just about to where our car is, and it's like needles in the face. This is not rain. This is all just spray coming off the ocean. So it's very, very salty. Wow. There we go. That is an impressive gust right there. So this is still, it's still hitting, and I can see more and more damage to the buildings around here. They're just not. They're just such a relentless strike on this area. It's just not stopping. Imagine taking a hammer and just hitting a wall for an hour. That first strike might not do too much, but after you pound on the wall for an hour, you're going to put a hole in it, and that is exactly what Fiona is doing to the town of Louisburg, just because it has not stopped, it has not slowed down, and it's just, as I said, I'm kind of amazed at how long this hurricane is continuing to hit this area.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, we talk about sustained winds and the damage that sustained winds can actually do to an area. That's certainly the case where you're situated. I want to put you on the spot for a second and ask you a comparison when it comes to this post-tropical cyclone to, say, a nor'easter that would hit very similar areas. Have you been in a nor'easter, and how does it compare to that?
Yeah, I've been in nor'easters. The nor'easter that I was in, the one I especially remember, is the one where I had our chief meteorologist Chris Scott with me, and we got a gust at 172 kilometers an hour. He fell, took me out. He says it's the other way around, but I'm just going to state for the record right now that no, he took me out. And the big difference between that and this is it was a heck of a lot colder. So it was all winter storm. This is relatively warm compared to that, but at the same time, in my dry suit, underneath my dry suit, I'm wearing a sweater and a couple of pairs of thermal underwear, essentially, to try and keep myself warm enough, because even though I'm not wet underneath this, it's still very cold.
Yeah, and I mean, I will ask you another question, Mark, because yes, you're from the Great Lakes in southern Ontario, and you do a whole lot of storm chasing in Ontario, whether it be tornadoes, chasing severe weather when it comes to thunderstorms, a lake effect, snow. Let's talk about those classic fall storms, because that's around the corner for us, whether you're in Ontario, Quebec, portions of Atlantic Canada. How do those winds off of the Great Lakes compare to areas across the Atlantic?
There's just no comparison. You just don't get this kind of wind coming off of Lake Ontario or Lake Erie. I mean, don't get me wrong, it can get strong, 100 kilometers an hour, but just this continuous blast like this, and I think we've seen some records of like 140, 150 kilometers an hour. We just generally don't see that outside of thunderstorms, and even then, we're talking about tornadoes when we're talking about those kinds of winds in the Great Lakes. Wow, the water is kind of cold, and so it's hitting, like it's going right through the little holes in my helmet here and just stinging the back of my head. This is, as I said, this is an unprecedented storm for this area, for myself, and I think for Nova Scotia.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you need a full wetsuit, Mark, just to really stay dry, because you've been going for a very long time, all day yesterday, through the overnight, early this morning. We talked about this potential landfall. Let's talk a little bit about the term landfall when it comes to tropical cyclones or hurricanes, because yes, we've seen the center of Fiona push over eastern Nova Scotia, but actually, this is something I recently discovered from one of our other meteorologists here, that we don't actually call it a quote-unquote landfall if it no longer carries full-on tropical characteristics. What are your thoughts on that?
Actually, to be quite honest, that's a new one for me. I've always said landfall. It just shows you how much I've been studying my meteorology in the last little while, which is not enough, obviously. But one of the things that always with these kinds of storms is you can't sort of look at the landfall and sort of say, oh, that's where the damage is going to happen there, where the center of the low is. When you get storms like this, you get a massive wind field. So you're talking about damage and effects that can stretch, in this case, from Halifax all the way out to Sydney. All along there, you're seeing effects from this storm. So, and Jesse, I got to throw it back into you because I'm having a little bit of trouble standing up. So, we'll discuss more later.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark. Also, we're drying off the camera, letting Mark have a little bit of a break because of the intense winds. Jacqueline, I want to loop you back in because conditions have been certainly ramping up, and we talk a lot about landfall. I want to get your opinion on landfall because the quote-unquote landfall occurred, or at least the approach or the onshore of Fiona happened early this morning, probably about 2 hours ago, but the worst of the conditions really started late last night and continued right through the overnight. So what can you tell our viewers when it comes to when to expect the worst of the conditions when considering a tropical cyclone?
Well, I mean, I think it usually is around the center of that, cyclone, right? In that eye wall and where we get those strongest winds. But the problem is, and as you've been probably explaining to viewers too, when you get these storms that start to transition to sort of a hybrid storm, then you get this cold air wrapping in and the wind field starts to expand, and that's what's happening right now. Like the winds that are hitting my face right now, it's brutal. It is not pleasant. It is not like chasing a hurricane down in Texas where it's, close to 30 degrees or upper 20s. It's probably feeling like about 4 or 5 degrees. So like the most lousy, wet rain hitting your face very, very aggressively. That's the word I have. But I also I heard you kind of talking about nor'easters, and it's interesting to me too, because the last time I was on PEI before this hurricane was in 2014 with Mark Robinson, just about 50 kilometers west of here on Summerside PEI, and we saw snowbanks and snow drifts 2 stories high. So you can imagine that tree right there behind me that's now landed on this home. The last time we were here, we were talking about drifts the size of that tree. I hope everybody is safe in this home. Hopefully they weren't home when this happened. You can actually see a couple uprooted trees just on this property alone. And this is just widespread. Like, I don't know my way around this city all that well. So I'm sure there's so much damage that we've yet to see just because we don't know exactly where to go. We're just kind of meandering around trying to do it safely. Jesse?
Wow, so many uprooted trees. The damage investigation will certainly continue on through this weekend. We also have Mark Robinson. It looks like he got his footing down on the ground. The winds have been really ramping up. Again, these peak wind gusts, both Jacqueline and Mark, have been really catching both of you off guard because they come in the matter of seconds. And they're quite significant. What are some of the wind gusts that you have been clocking in, Mark? I know you have your tool ready.
Jesse, sorry, I think you asked what the strongest wind gusts I've been getting. It's really, really super hard to hear. I've got 90 kilometers an hour on this, on my little anemometer. But it's not an amazing anemometer. It's a very, very good one. But it tends to be about 20% below what the actual wind speeds are. So even though I'm getting 90 kilometers an hour, this is probably well over 100 kilometers an hour right now. Now, one thing I have noticed in about the last, I'm going to say about the last 10, 15 minutes, the storm surge that was pushing all the way up into here, like where I'm standing right now, it's no longer pushing that far in. It's a little bit further back. The winds feel at least as strong as they have, but that surge is pulling back. That's likely because the tide is going down, so you're not going to get that surge. It was the big issue and the big worry that we had was that some of the maximum surge was going to come in right at high tide. And of course, combine those two together and you're, whoa, going to be in trouble. And as soon as I said that, here comes the surge right behind me. Coming back to where I was saying it wasn't coming to. Mother Nature does like to mess with me, and this is often what happens, because these storms can be somewhat unpredictable. And this one, I think one of the biggest one of the biggest things that was hard to predict was how long the winds were going to be going afterwards. And quite often with these storms in this part of the world, they're gone. They just come in and they're gone. This one has come in and it's sticking around. And I think that's what's doing the damage to the town, is just this relentless pounding of the winds, the waves, and the storm surge.
Yeah. And again, the entirety of this post-tropical cyclone, it's moving due north at about 40 to 43 kilometers per hour. So not very quickly. It's very stalled out over some areas of the maritime provinces. Jacqueline, you've been seeing winds coming in out of the north for quite some time. We're starting to see a little bit of a wraparound with this system. So I'm showing it on satellite imagery. You could see the churning of a lot of the cloud and the rain wrapping around it. We've had some breaks in the heavy rain, but it's that sustained wind that we're really holding on to, and it's pushing a lot of this open water over the land.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, it doesn't take a lot of rain. It's just a constant rain, right? That can really start to, you know, pond and pool in certain areas aside from storm surge. One of the worst flooding disasters I've ever been with was in South Carolina in 2014 or 15, and it was like light, steady rain for 3 days. You'd never even think that it was going to flood, and boy does it flood, because all it takes is that constant rain for a long, prolonged period. I want to come over and show you this tree, if we can go a little bit closer to this, because the force of these winds, you know, you've been talking a lot about the peak of the storm. This happened during the peak of the storm. You know, I don't think we're going to see a lot more in the way of trees coming down. Maybe we might, but I don't think so. The gusts are still pretty powerful, but these gusts, this probably would have been 120 to 130 kilometers an hour at its peak. I got to be careful of my footing here. I can actually feel that soil kind of sinking there, and got to be careful of this sidewalk. Yeah, but the other thing too is there's a scent in the air, kind of a scent of wood. You know, like I find this in tornadoes too, where you've got like kind of a lumber scent, and there's a lot of debris and tree shred all over the place, and I can taste a salty sea air. That's what I'm tasting right now, very salty air. But it really hurts, that rain just pounding against you relentlessly for hours, being out in the conditions. But you know, if there's anything we can do to help locals, it's you know, we're out here. If anybody needs any supplies, we've got lots. So come find us. We're kind of meandering around Charlottetown. Well, don't come find us now. Come find us later when the storm settles down. But a situation that's just evolving moment by moment here. But my heart goes out to everybody here. Like, I'm looking at this neighborhood, I see wrinkles, that'd be roof shingles coming off that home there. You know, lots of flooding here. I don't know if these people have subfloors. It looks like they might. Could be flooding there below in their basement. And of course, you know, the tree damage, the uprooted trees. And you know, something my cameraman Steve Mongeau said before was, and I thought it was so well said, is, you know, all these power lines, these poles, those can all be replaced, right? We can get more lumber to build those, but these trees, they can't be replaced.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Jacqueline. And it's amazing to see both of you simultaneously report from just slightly different locations with very different impacts. Jacqueline, the water is really swinging through. It's sweeping through all the streets. It's about ankle deep on you. And Mark, the winds are whipping that around. Yeah. He's just trying to find his footing on the ground. It puts things into perspective of how strong these winds really are. Mark, you can't see what Jacqueline is really dealing with right now, but we've had massive trees just uprooted and being pushed onto homes, unfortunately. You've also mentioned you've seen a lot of structural damage, buildings ripped apart. What are your insights on what to expect in the coming hours where you are in Louisburg, Nova Scotia?
Well, I think we can expect, unfortunately, with these kinds of winds, we can expect more damage. I mean, I was thinking this was going to be over soon, beginning to ramp down, and it just feels like it's just not stopping. And I think that's sort of the most amazing thing about this, and very unfortunate, especially for the town of Louisburg, is that it's just not stopping. Sydney, another area that's being hit very, very hard. I've seen some reports from other chasers of Sydney roofs coming off there, massive power outages. We haven't had powers here for a very long time, and even us getting back to Sydney after this is done is going to be very difficult, because there are trees down over top of the highway between here and Sydney. And I actually saw, when we were on our way down here to the dock, there was a tree down, a big tree down, and luckily it had gone between the two buildings rather than on top of them. But you know, we can't even really see that far, so I can't even give you a good idea of how much damage is in the town at this point, other than those couple of spots that we happen to have gone past and seen. And then, of course, the storm surge here. At this point, though, that flooding does look like it hasn't gone into the buildings along the shoreline at here at the docks all that much. There may be other low-lying areas that we simply can't get to that we haven't seen yet. We know over the lighthouse that there's an area there that's quite low-lying. The lighthouse itself, we can't see it. It's somewhere back in there. I'm hoping it's okay. I was talking to some locals and they said, yeah, the waves hit those. Oh, wow. Oh, sorry, Jensen, what you said. Wow, that was a very, very strong gust, and it accompanied the storm surge coming in right here. Wow. So as I was saying, they said the lighthouse gets hit quite often. I'm hoping it's okay. We'll get a chance later on when this begins to die down at some point, and we'll start to be able to take a look around the town and the areas, and eventually we'd have to get out and get back, say, to Halifax, and eventually back home. But keep in mind, we get to go home, but the people living here have a huge cleanup to do, and it's going to take a while.
Yeah, that's it's so true, Mark. You mentioned the storm cleanup. There's significant damage not only when it comes to storm surge, the water flooding the streets, the homes being damaged by not only the water flowing through the streets, but also the uprooted trees falling on roofs that Jacqueline mentioned and she showed on her screen. I think we're going to give both our team field members a little bit of a break to dry their camera gear off. I want to remind everyone that they are very experienced storm chasers. We do not advise anyone to be out during the peak of this storm, which we have been seeing. It's still packing wind speeds of just over 140 kilometers per hour. It's moving relatively slow, which is why we're starting to see some very significant damage, especially across eastern Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island. What you're looking at here is the current conditions associated with Fiona. I want to walk you through the track. We've been live streaming this for hours, and if you were with us late yesterday after the dinner hour and right through the overnight, we've continued to provide updates for you. It continues to maintain its strength as possibly a post-tropical cyclone out towards eastern Maritimes and up towards Labrador. As we get into Sunday, early morning Sunday, we'll likely start to see some significant damage being pushed into northern areas like the Gaspé, like portions of western Newfoundland. This is just one visual coming out of the city of Halifax with uprooted trees. So we've really seen no shortage of storm damage. We've also seen no shortage of some peak wind gusts, and we've actually tied, or if not broken, some of these records when it comes to the meteorology behind the weather. Peak wind gusts, 124 kilometers per hour. That was reported in Halifax at the airport. And some of the major impacts that we've been concerned about heading into this weekend have not only been the winds, but also the flooding amounts of rain that pushed through. If you are in Sydney, Nova Scotia, you were forecasted to receive anywhere between 100 to 200 millimeters of rainfall, flooding a major concern, as well as storm surge. I want to also talk about the pressure records. This is quite interesting when you dive into the statistics and the meteorology behind systems. Typically, we see very low pressure systems associated with nor'easters, which was our previous all-time low Canadian pressure, 940.2 millibars in St. Anthony. We beat that over Hart Island, and that just is one record that we will continue to track for you. Some of the wave heights have really been ramping up along coastal sections of Nova Scotia. Again, if you are in that area, you're experiencing power outages. And I want to give you a quick update when it comes to power outages, because they have surpassed 400,000 customers in the province of Nova Scotia alone. We're expecting these outages to continue into the weekend, unfortunately, and they stretch into areas of western Newfoundland as well. And if you are concerned about the heavy rain, that continues to be an issue well into our Saturday afternoon. You could see the center of the post-tropical cyclone Fiona. It travels further north, essentially traveling due north at about 40 kilometers per hour. This is about later tonight after that dinner hour. A lot of that rainfall will have cleared from the Maritimes, which is good news. And then heading into our Sunday, a lot of that moisture will be focused further north across Labrador. We have a little bit more active weather in the long-range forecast by Monday morning. Back to school, back to work. Storm cleanup continues, obviously, into our work week ahead, but there's a bit more moisture heading our way. So there goes a lot of the atmospheric moisture associated with Fiona. We also have another plume of moisture heading towards the southern Maritimes early part of our work week. And we actually have that plume of moisture headed towards Newfoundland by the middle of the week. Now, we have some footage filed by our team field members. Again, thank you so much for joining us through our live streaming. You can catch us anywhere from our social media platforms, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, as well as our Storm Center app. If you did not download our app yet, make sure you do so because we have a lot of content on there for you to watch. Let's take a look back at where Mark and Jacqueline were a little bit earlier on.
Down at the Louisburg, the pier, down the dock area, and we were actually up on the pier doing some shots. It was relatively safe, not a problem. And then, almost out of nowhere, that happened. The surge is coming in. There has been that wind shift, so it's coming out of the south, and we've had a wind shift, and that has brought the surge in. Actually, yeah, you can see the surge coming in. The waves are overtopping the docks now. It's sort of making its way, and you can see the flooding beginning back here. There's a couple of trucks there. I mean, they're fine because they've got well above the water. They're not going to have a big problem. Our small car can't handle that. We got out of there as quickly as we could because we just do not want to be trapped by the surge, especially if you're out on the pier.
All right, so we are in downtown Charlottetown and now getting a look at some of the damage early morning here as the sun's starting, or daylight's occurring, not really sun, but you see quite a bit of tree damage here by this car. This is on one of the side streets. Lots of tree branches snapped, like this one here, you can see, but probably more damage, more impressive damage, if you will, is over here by this church. There's a lot of tree limbs down here, like just widespread all over the place here. And one of these trees actually was uprooted. Oh, I gotta be careful, there's some power lines. Yeah, power lines, gotta be very careful. But check this out. And I mean, this has kind of been all over the city, like completely uprooted tree here. There you go. So there we go, that peak of the storm, this is what was happening here in Charlottetown. And this is just one little street. This is pretty widespread across the whole city.
Our Storm Center coverage continues, as well as our live stream coverage as well. We've been live tracking from not only in the studio here, but also out in the field, scattered across Atlantic Canada. Thank you so much for joining us, whether that be on TV or on your Storm Center app or across social media platforms. Thank you so much for being with us this Saturday. Let's talk about where Fiona is tracking. It has been sitting over very warm sea surface temperatures, which is why, or at least part of the reason why it reached a Category 4 at one point in time. Now, it's been pushing further to the north, entering portions of Atlantic Canada over cooler waters, which is why we're starting to see, or at least we already started to see, some of the tropical characteristics fizzle out. What do I mean by that? I mean that it doesn't actually have the true characteristics of a hurricane anymore, but I really want to highlight and emphasize that it still has been producing major impacts, significant damage across Atlantic Canada. It's now considered post-tropical in nature, but it's still packing in very significant wind gusts. We've reached some record winds when it comes to peak wind gusts, over 130 kilometers per hour in Charlottetown, PEI. That is where Jacqueline has been reporting live from. We've also been seeing water flood the streets. Storm surge warning still in place for several communities across Eastern Maritimes. southern Newfoundland. We've seen those actually creep in across the southern Avalon as well. So if you are across Newfoundland, I know we haven't been showing you a whole lot in your forecast throughout this coverage simply because a lot of the storm damage is still focused across the maritime provinces, but we're starting to see those winds really creep in close to the southwestern corridor of the island, and the peak wind gusts have been just reaching over 100 kilometers per hour. Now, the peak of, or at least the brunt of the storm has been focused across eastern Nova Scotia. Part of the center of Fiona, or at least what's left of Fiona, has been crossing eastern Nova Scotia. And some of the sustained winds, very significant in nature, and the peak wind gusts have exceeded 140 kilometers per hour. Rainfall associated with Fiona has been something to really talk about. We saw the rainfall push in across the maritime provinces yesterday, and that was not associated with the hurricane itself, but it was part of the weather story here. It was a trough of low pressure that brought the rain, but it also was responsible for sweeping up some of the tropical remnants of Fiona. And the rainfall continues. I'm showing you satellite and radar here. Pockets of very heavy rainfall, highlighted in the yellow, have been reported, and parts of Cape Breton Highlands have been seeing some really heavy amounts of rain. If you're wondering what was in your forecast, actually, isolated amounts in excess of 200 millimeters of rainfall over Cape Breton, over eastern Nova Scotia has been in your forecast. And another area of concern, southwestern Newfoundland, not highly populated, but we're starting to see some hurricane force winds push in at least over the coastal areas. Storm surge is going to be a major concern heading into this afternoon for you across Newfoundland, but let's discuss some of the major factors across the maritime provinces when it comes to Fiona, or at least what's left of this post-tropical cyclone. Storm surge has been a major concern, and if you were with us not too long ago, we had footage coming out of Louisburg, Nova Scotia, where the floodwaters have been sweeping on shore, and they've been pushing in flooding waters through the streets of Prince Edward Island as well, uprooting trees. It's really the amount of precipitation that's been falling in these areas paired with the very gusty winds. That's been, part of the reason why we've seen significant damage in some of these urban areas, and we'll continue to monitor that. A quick look at some of the damage being done in, say, the city of Halifax, uprooted trees. The damage is not only confined to Halifax, it's also stretching all along the coastal areas, which we'll continue to track for you. Another aspect of Fiona has been the sheer size of this cyclone. It's stretched all the way, thousands of kilometers over the Atlantic waters. It swept through portions of the Caribbean. It tracked just west of Bermuda as well, producing significant swells, very dangerous surf and wave heights as well. And some of the estimated wave heights have reached, or at least peaked, over 12 meters. Anywhere you're seeing on your screen in the purples and the magentas signify anywhere between 6 to up to 12 meters high in wave heights. A lot of this water has been displaced. It's moved further onshore, impacting coastal areas. I mentioned some of the records. Another aspect of this storm is just the actual intensity of it. It reached a low pressure, a central pressure of 964.4 millibars, and that pushed over parts of Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. We'll continue to monitor all of the records because there's a number of them when it comes to rainfall as well as pressure. Now, we're going to be continuing our live coverage when it comes to all your Fiona needs as well as some other tropical developments, but we have a little bit of a recap. Have a look at this.
This was the view inside Hurricane Fiona as it barreled toward Bermuda. The Saildrone Explorer SD-1078 was sent into Fiona on September 22nd while it was a Category 4 hurricane. The uncrewed surface vehicle detected 15-meter waves and wind speeds of 160 kilometers per hour. At one point, it was traveling at 64 kilometers per hour as it slid down a huge wave.
Long before Hurricane Fiona set its sights on Atlantic Canada, it was causing destruction in the Caribbean. On September 15th, Tropical Depression 7 strengthened to a tropical storm and was assigned the name Fiona. 2 days later, it had become a hurricane, one that was headed straight for Puerto Rico. It made landfall with wind speeds of 140 kilometers per hour and knocked out power to most of the island. One rain gauge recorded 796 millimeters of rain. Roads were stripped of pavement, roofs torn off, and nearly 1 million residents were left without drinking water. Early reports indicated that 8 people were killed. U.S. President Joe Biden declared a state of emergency. On September 19th, the eye of the storm passed over the Dominican Republic. It was the first hurricane to make landfall in that country in 18 years. Between 200 and 400 millimeters of rain fell, and a state of emergency was declared for the hardest-hit provinces. At least 2 people were killed there. Fiona continued north and picked up strength over the warm waters of the Caribbean, becoming a Category 3 storm by September 20th, making it the first major hurricane of the 2022 Atlantic hurricane season. The eye of the storm passed over the Turks and Caicos Islands, dumping heavy rain and causing flooding before strengthening again to a Category 4 as it chugged towards Bermuda, with its sights eventually set on Atlantic Canada. Canadians on the East Coast are on high alert as they brace for the impacts of Hurricane Fiona. Forecasters fear it will be stronger than Dorian, the costliest storm on record for the area. Now let's compare the two. On September 7, 2019, Dorian crossed over all 3 maritime provinces, bringing widespread heavy rain, dangerous surf, and wind speeds over 140 kilometers per hour. At one point, 500,000 customers were left without power, some for over a week. Storm surge destroyed wharfs and damaged boats, and thousands of trees were toppled. Here's Tyler Hamilton with what we can expect from Fiona.
Well, Fiona, this is going to be a historic storm. Atlantic Canada, locally over 200 millimeters of rainfall forecast, but almost more noteworthy is the wind speeds and the pressure, likely below 940 millibars. That would make this a Canadian record, and with strong pressure like that, wind gusts will be in excess of 140.
With Dorian, damage was estimated at $102 million, but it's important to note that it hit at low tide. Fiona is forecast to make landfall at high tide, which is why it may have the dubious distinction of topping Dorian's destructive path.
Here on the Magdalen Island, the winds are really picking up. We have recorded gusts well over 100 kilometers an hour. Actually, the biggest one was 132 kilometers an hour, which ties the all-time record for Magdalen Island. As you can see behind me now, the sea is rising and starting to cover the roads with debris and water. It's going to be flooding pretty soon. The problem also is that it's going to be conditions like that for the next 6 to 8 hours. So problems going to tumble more and more over the next hours.
Long before Hurricane Fiona set its sights on Atlantic Canada, it was causing destruction in the Caribbean. On September 15th, Tropical Depression 7 strengthened to a tropical storm and was assigned the name Fiona. 2 days later, it had become a hurricane, one that was headed straight for Puerto Rico. It made landfall with wind speeds of 140 kilometers per hour and knocked out power to most of the island. One rain gauge recorded 796 millimeters of rain. Roads were stripped of pavement, roofs torn off, and nearly 1 million residents were left without drinking water. Early reports indicated that 8 people were killed. U.S. President Joe Biden declared a state of emergency. On September 19th, the eye of the storm passed over the Dominican Republic. It was the first hurricane to make landfall in that country in 18 years. Between 200 and 400 millimeters of rain fell, and a state of emergency was declared for the hardest-hit provinces. At least 2 people were killed there. Fiona continued north and picked up strength over the warm waters of the Caribbean, becoming a Category 3 storm by September 20th, making it the first major hurricane of the 2022 Atlantic hurricane season. The eye of the storm passed over the Turks and Caicos Islands, dumping heavy rain and causing flooding before strengthening again to a Category 4 as it chugged towards Bermuda, with its sights eventually set on Atlantic Canada.
This was the view inside Hurricane Fiona as it barreled toward Bermuda. The sail drone Explorer SD-1078 was sent into Fiona on September 22nd while it was a Category 4 hurricane. The uncrewed surface vehicle detected 15-meter waves and wind speeds of 160 kilometers per hour. At one point, it was traveling at 64 kilometers per hour as it slid down a huge wave.
Canadians on the East Coast are on high alert as they brace for the impacts of Hurricane Fiona. Forecasters fear it will be stronger than Dorian, the costliest storm on record for the area. Now let's compare the two. On September 7, 2019, Dorian crossed over all three maritime provinces, bringing widespread heavy rain, dangerous surf, and wind speeds over 140 kilometers per hour. At one point, 500,000 customers were left without power, some for over a week. Storm surge destroyed wharfs and damaged boats, and thousands of trees were toppled. Here's Tyler Hamilton with what we can expect from Fiona.
Well, Fiona, this is going to be a historic storm. Atlantic Canada, locally over 200 millimeters of rainfall forecast, but almost more noteworthy is the wind speeds and the pressure, likely below 940 millibars. That would make this a Canadian record, and with strong pressure like that, wind gusts will be in excess of 140.
With Dorian, damage was estimated at $102 million, but it's important to note that it hit at low tide. Fiona is forecast to make landfall at high tide, which is why it may have the dubious distinction of topping Dorian's destructive path. Long before Hurricane Fiona set its sights on Atlantic Canada, it was causing destruction in the Caribbean. On September 15th, Tropical Depression 7 strengthened to a tropical storm and was assigned the name Fiona. 2 days later, it had become a hurricane, one that was headed straight for Puerto Rico. It made landfall with wind speeds of 140 kilometers per hour and knocked out power to most of the island. One rain gauge recorded 796 millimeters of rain. Roads were stripped of pavement, roofs torn off, and nearly 1 million residents were left without drinking water. Early reports indicated that 8 people were killed. U.S. President Joe Biden declared a state of emergency. On September 19th, the eye of the storm passed over the Dominican Republic. It was the first hurricane to make landfall in that country in 18 years. Between 200 and 400 millimeters of rain fell, and a state of emergency was declared for the hardest hit provinces. At least 2 people were killed there. Fiona continued north and picked up strength over the warm waters of the Caribbean, becoming a Category 3 storm by September 20th, making it the first major hurricane of the 2022 Atlantic hurricane season. The eye of the storm passed over the Turks and Caicos Islands, dumping heavy rain and causing flooding before strengthening again to a Category 4 as it chugged towards Bermuda, with its sights eventually set on Atlantic Canada.
Welcome back to our live coverage. I'm taking over for Jessie. She needs a little bit of a breather. We've been covering this storm live for the last few hours. We still have our teams out in PEI, Cape Breton, Halifax, Ile de la Madeleine. So we have multiple provinces covered. The bulk of it right now are the 3 teams in Cape Breton Island, where Mark Robinson is, Jacqueline Whittles, and PEI. And what's left of what was formerly the eye is just between Cape Breton Island and Ile de la Madeleine right now. So take a quick look at our watches and warnings right now. All the Gulf shores across all 5 provinces have our storm surge warnings. The last high tide was about 8 p.m. last night, so we are coming up to another one, and the worst of the storm surge will likely be this morning, especially for the north shore of PEI. So not being impacted by the rainfall totals along the shores, it's more so the wind, the surf, and the storm surge itself. So in terms of our wind gusts, right now, again, this isn't the strongest winds recorded in the storm. This is just those stations. So it's kind of like a needle in the haystack. So for instance, we did break the all-time Canadian record for the lowest pressure ever recorded. Not only did we break it, we smashed it, almost 8 millibars over the old record of 940, which was only set in St. Anthony in Newfoundland. So Nova Scotia is taking over the new record, and we did have local records as well for some provincial records for September. And in terms of our pressure, it's not going to continue to lower. The worst of the pressure is over, so we'll slowly start to weaken the storm, but that also means the wind field, the strongest winds aren't going to be quite as tight to the center, so they're going to branch out, and that's when we're going to get probably more power outages. So this is what we're currently looking at. Quick math here, we're up about 500,000 customers, so that's not people, let's say about 4 people per house, so we're up around 2 million people. That is well over 3/4 of the population of the Maritimes. So most people, especially Cape Breton, PEI, are now without power, and we still have our hurricane warnings for again, those hardest hit areas. St. John's, you're used to getting the brunt of storms, but we aren't seeing the worst on the Avalon. This is a great view of some of those waves. Again, some of these waves haven't been impeded for the last, let's say, 4 days. They might have originated down near Turks and Caicos, and they've just been spiraling, and this is the first land they've encountered. Look at Charlottetown, the trees are down, sidewalks thrown up, roofs are going to be removed, and yeah, this is going to be in darkness, so I hope people have battery packs for their radios, their phones, so you can still stay somewhat connected to what's going on around the area. And again, today we're going to see this slowly progress towards Newfoundland. It's going to sit over the Gulf and slowly start to spread out. So here's a look at our current radar. You can still see the beautiful structure, the rotation right around the center. Again, just between Cape Breton and that's Ile de la Madeleine, that little unorganized strip, almost like an inverted sable island in the middle of the Gulf. So that is where our Meteo Media correspondent is there. So the heaviest rain getting right back to Fredericton. Fredericton, you actually had more rain on Thursday than you're going to be getting from this. So you had a quick warm-up with about 50 to 60 millimeters. So this is just kind of a cherry on top of maybe a Sunday you didn't want. So on top of those hurricane warnings, of course, we're going to still have our rainfall warnings right across anywhere. Definitely the exposed areas still going to be seeing gusts over 100 kilometers per hour through the remainder of the day. Just going to look at our current wind gusts again. We're going to see likely the worst of the gusts dying out by midnight tonight. So we still have all day to go with all the Atlantic provinces still seeing gusts over 100 kilometers per hour. The last area to see the 100 kilometer per hour gusts will likely be the South Shore in Newfoundland by this evening. So Nova Scotia, by this afternoon, you're going to start to see it start to ease. But the focus, I think, for the next few days is definitely going to be the north shore of Prince Edward Island. So the good news for Charlottetown is you're sheltered, you're on the south side of it, but you're still going to be getting the wind, but you are sheltered from the worst of the storm surge and the worst of the waves there. So this is still a post-tropical storm. So what that means is it's lost its characteristics of a hurricane. So what a hurricane has, it has a warm core. There's a little bit of warm air stuck in the middle. And when we talk about a nor'easter, you can have a cold front and a warm front. They're formed by two air masses mixing. Well, a hurricane It's just a whole lot of tropical air. And now that this storm has interacted with the trough that actually was responsible for drawing it right into Atlantic Canada, that cold air is now going to start to give it some fronts, and it's still going to be feeding the storm for the next, let's say 24 hours. This is still going to be a very impactful storm. And if you're up towards Labrador, Labrador City, Goose Bay, that's where you could be looking at some snow from this. So in terms of our water temperatures, this is what I was looking at over the last couple of days. So a lot of people are wondering, why was this one so much more ferocious than past ones that have come up? And we always talk about the cold water that kind of kills the hurricanes before they get to Canada. Well, I was looking into some of the stats a couple days ago, and we've been talking about how warm the Atlantic waters are around Canada for the last month or so. They've been 3 or 5 degrees above where they should be. And now for a hurricane to keep feeding and growing, the water needs to be about 27 degrees. So this storm was actually able to continue to feed almost up until Sable Island, and that's only about 200 to 400 kilometers from shore. So at the speed it's moving, that's only about 6 hours it's going to be going over that cold water, whereas normally that threshold, the 27 degree threshold, is about 800 kilometers from Nova Scotia, which would give it about 12 days or 12 hours to weaken. That is more than enough time for, let's say, a category 1 or 2 to go into post-tropical and really start to die out. Here's Mark. We have Mark up in Louisburg in the top end of Nova Scotia, Cape Breton. Mark, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Give me a lowdown on what you're dealing with this morning.
Well, I can tell you what we're dealing with is a relentless storm here along the coast. We're expecting this to ramp down, the winds to die down a little bit, and they have not done that at all. I'm just getting taking a reading here. I just got, that's right there, there you go. That was 86 kilometers an hour, probably quite a bit higher than that. This anemometer tends to register about 20% below what the actual wind speed is. And the one thing that has sort of receded a little bit is the storm surge. So you can sort of see the surge back there on the shore. It's pushed up, up along the pier here in Louisburg, and that has pulled back a bit, I think, because the tide is going out. But the winds, especially along the shoreline, have not stopped. I actually saw there was a couple of chasers in town here, and they were up by the fortress, and it does look like there's a forest up there that has just been absolutely flat. We're going to go up and take a look at that later on, but you can see, like this, I mean, I don't think I've ever been in a storm in eastern Canada that just goes on and on like this. This feels much more like a tropical system, like when you're down on the Florida coast and it comes in, it's not moving very fast. That's what this feels like. The one big difference though, this is a lot colder. These winds are very cold. Even though I've got my dry suit on, I've actually got a sweater underneath this and a couple of pairs of thermal, like long johns. I'm starting to get a little bit cold, finally. And I've been out and doing this for a while. And at first very warm. Now the winds begin to shift around and you're getting a little bit more of that cold air. Yeah, starting to feel it.
Mark, have you noticed the winds changing direction much at all?
Yes, that's one of the big things. Earlier, the winds were coming they're coming this way, and now they're coming straight up the pier. Slight shift off the pier, but we've been definitely seeing that whole shift. Now they've been like this. They've been sort of in this direction for quite a while. Like the last couple of hours, they've been coming from this direction, and that has just been relentlessly hitting the town, tearing bits and pieces off of buildings. I've seen at least one house where the roof has been removed. move. In fact, I actually had to stop the car because the debris was flying off there, and you know, I couldn't go past because there was flying debris and it was going to hit the car, so I had to be very, very careful. So that's what's going on here. This is not a quick one and done storm. This is a relentless slog of a storm. Whew.
That is, I feel like you're going to be exhausted by lunchtime just having to fight that wind. What would you compare this to that you've been in through your career?
Oh, wow. You know what? Every storm is unique. This one has characteristics of different storms, so I don't want to compare it directly, but one of the ones that it does remind me of a lot is Katrina, of all the ones, because Katrina just hit us with winds for so long, and this one's doing the same thing. Now, we are not talking about the same sort of wind speed. Katrina was considerably stronger than this, but it's just that ongoing, just keeps going. You know, add that storm surge in, everything else. That's the kind of the system that it has. But at the same time, it's also got that nor'easters. So you have to combine a bunch of different storms. But this one definitely unprecedented for me on the East Coast.
That is awesome, Mark. Thanks for that. I hope you can still stay standing. You're going to be in the brunt of it still for another few hours. This really isn't going anywhere for you.
Yeah, I'm kind of afraid you were going to say that. I am officially getting tired.
Oh. All right, Mark, take a break.
Oh.
And there he goes. Yeah, Mark's definitely been out there for some good nor'easters, but yeah, this that rain can hurt a little more when it's coming in sideways, unlike the snow that can still hurt and maybe get some frostbite. But that really puts this into perspective of what we're looking at. That's definitely something we've seen in Florida, the Gulf Shores, the Caribbean, but just to see that on Canadian soil really really brings it to light of what we're dealing with here. I still want to go back to our wind gusts here over the last 24 hours. Again, the landfall was on the south side of Nova Scotia, right at the base of Cape Breton Island. I'm just going to put the model back here for, let's do it for 12 hours, and we can just see how it came on shore. So when we're talking about, I want to go back to the pressure record. So the reason why we broke it by, let's say, 8 millibars is because it's almost like a needle in a haystack with our stations. We don't have that many stations out in Atlantic Canada. For instance, we have Halifax, we have Sydney, and this little Heart Island is just out on a peninsula there. So this storm made landfall basically right on that station. So that means we're getting that minimal pressure reading right on the station. Whereas if it was, let's say, 50 or 100 kilometers an hour in either direction, that might have just washed that record right out. And even though it would have been the lowest pressure somewhere, we wouldn't actually get the reading of it right in that exact spot. So that's one check mark that we had a question mark. We were pretty certain. I actually had a little bit of a bet going with Tyler Hamilton here of what the pressure was going to get down to. And yeah, so we have now accomplished that. So I want to bring Kabir in to talk about what we're seeing on social media and some of the best pictures we're starting to see.
Well, hey there, Kevin. Great to see you. I'd love to be able to hear you as well. Let's talk a little bit now about what we're going to be seeing in terms of our social media. So right here is a couple of down power lines now as we take a look at, well, what is now, I guess, to be the aftermath in some portions. So let's go ahead now and take a peek at the destruction that, well, Hurricane Fiona, or Tropical Storm Fiona, has left. Now, we can see here some of those outdoor patios that we saw with some nice planters in them have been lost. And of course, we can see some downed trees in addition to that. Now, what we're going to want to do is also think about the cleanup that's going to be taking place for much of the region. And that's something that's already in progress. If you do see down power lines, though, I'm sure we've already mentioned it, but please don't go ahead and touch them. Leave that to the professionals, especially because they can be electrically charged. Now, another thing I wanted to mention here, of course, was this porta potty that has definitely taken a bit of a tumble for the worse. Now, thanks so much to everybody that's uploading this to Twitter. This home has received quite a bit of that damage. As we see, well, it's hanging off of the Atlantic coast here, and that was, of course, Newfoundland. I hope whoever's home that is safe. Now, this is what the water looked like as it came up from the ocean into, of course, the shore, with quite a bit of debris moving its way around. And you can see why the power outages are so widespread. Over 410,000 people without power at the moment. Let's go ahead and take a look at Nova Scotia. So 414,587 to be exact in terms of what we're going to be seeing for power outages right now for Nova Scotia. For New Brunswick, that's at 39,174. Prince Edward Island as well, sitting in about the 80,000 range. And for Newfoundland, 614 at the moment. Expect that number to increase as the winds increase and the system makes its way toward the north. So quite a bit of updates here. Another thing I wanted to mention was Halifax Stansted Airport. I went ahead there and was going to show you that cancellation board. Flights looking to resume past about the 11 o'clock hour, according to the airport's website. But of course, check with your airline, check with your air service provider. They're going to be the ones that would be able to tell you more about, of course, what's going to be happening with that air travel situation. So we've got meteorologist Kevin McKay here with us, joining us for the broadcast. Of course, you're holding things together, telling us about what's going on with the storm. Where is it headed right now, Kevin?
Well, it's not heading anywhere too fast, that's for sure. It's crazy that we're already talking about planes and air is already getting back into business later today. It seems like this should be shutting things down for quite a while. I do want to give you some good news first. Here's our storm surge warning still in place, but we are about 45 minutes past high tide. So for the next, let's say, 6 hours, we're heading in a good direction. Hopefully by then, many areas, especially along the Gulf Coast, will start to ease a bit. But then once we get towards 2 p.m., that's when we're going to start getting back towards those high tides. And somewhere is going to still be in that the worst storm surge again. So we'll have to watch for that shoreline flooding. But I want to go back out to Mark and Jacqueline first in PEI to see what's going on there.
All right, so we are in downtown Charlottetown and now getting a look at some of the damage early morning here as the sun's starting, or daylight's occurring, not really sun, but you see quite a bit of tree damage here by this car. This is on one of the side streets. Lots of tree branches snapped, like this one here, you can see, but probably more damage, more impressive damage, if you will, is over here by this church. There's a lot of tree limbs down here, like just widespread all over the place here. And one of these trees actually was uprooted. Oh, I gotta be careful, there's some power lines. Yeah, power lines, gotta be very careful. But check this out. And I mean, this is kind of been all over the city, like completely uprooted tree here. There you go. So there we go, that peak of the storm, this is what was happening here in Charlottetown. And this is just one little street. This is pretty widespread across the whole city.
Down at the Louisburg, the pier, down the dock area. And we were actually up on the pier doing some shots. It was relatively safe, not a problem. And then, almost out of nowhere, that happened. The surge is coming in. There has been that wind shift, so it's coming out of the south, and we've had a wind shift, and that has brought the surge in. Actually, yeah, you can even see the surge coming in. The waves are overtopping the docks now, just sort of making its way, and you can see the flooding beginning back here. There's a couple of trucks there. I mean, they're fine because they've got well above the water. They're not going to have a big problem. Our small car can't handle that. We got out of there as quickly as we could because we just do not want to be trapped by the surge, especially if you're out on the pier.
here on the Magdalen Island, the winds are really picking up. We have recorded gusts well over 100 kilometers an hour. Actually, the biggest one was 132 kilometers an hour, which ties the all-time record for Magdalen Island. As you can see behind me now, the sea is rising and starting to cover the roads with debris, and water is going to be flooding pretty soon. The problem also is that it's going to be conditions like that for the next 6 to 8 hours. So problems going to tumble more and more over the next hours.
Yeah, so of course the winds are still the #1 concern. Instead of talking about what's been happening in the last 12 hours, let's see what we're in store for the next few hours. So this is a perfect one because we have all three places where we just heard from: Île-Madeleine, Charlottetown, and Cape Breton. So through the next few hours, we're going to see those peak gusts of around 140, 130 start to deteriorate. You can see those deeper burgundies and even those like light pinks there. They're going to start to fade as we get through the afternoon. The eye, it's not really an eye, but the very strong low center is going to slowly drift towards the west shore of Newfoundland, and that's when we're going to shift to more of a westerly flow across the south of the Gulf. So that's going to help PEI. You're not going to have a direct onshore flow, but through the evening you can see that southerly flow, southwesterly flow for southwest Newfoundland. Going to start to see those start to deteriorate so we're thinking Burgeo, Port aux Basques, and maybe Stephenville will likely be the last places later this evening to see those gusts over 100 kilometers per hour. So there's a little, maybe something to look forward to, a little light at the end of the tunnel, but where there certainly is no light, just a whole lot of tunnel is in PEI. So let's check in with Jacqueline right now. Jacqueline, what's been the most surprising thing you've seen so far?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess the surprising wind gusts, to be honest, because you expect sustained winds, but all of a sudden the winds will sort of die down, Kev, and then all of a sudden you'll get a gust that practically takes you right off your feet. You know, I think that's probably been the unexpected thing, is that even though the storm has been sort of ramping down, we still have a lot more wind to get through, and obviously some damage to be had. So you can see here all this tree shrub. This has been the constant theme through streets in Charlottetown. We've got a big tree uprooted here in front of this home here. You can see, look at the size of this root system, and it would take wind gusts 120, 130 kilometers an hour to probably uproot this, and actually splitting this concrete right in half. So very impressive. And there's still debris flying around. I got to be careful myself. Look at those roots. I mean, I don't know if you've ever tried to dig out a shrub in your garden with a shovel, and how solid even just a shrub is into the earth. So imagine the force. I mean, look at the size of this trunk. That's half the size of me, just the trunk, in terms of its diameter. We're looking, oh, watch yourself, cameraman Steve, careful. We got lots of debris, and my cameraman almost just walked into a tree. Be careful. All right, everything's good. But yes, it's cold. That's the other thing. I think, you know, it's a north wind, as you know, Kev, and it's really got that cold, bitter, raw, salty kind of feel. You know, it's really uncomfortable out here, to be very honest. When you're usually chasing a tropical system, it's usually very warm. With this, it feels kind of like a blend of a nor'easter and a tropical system. So what else can I tell you? I mean, I have not actually seen more than, I'm going to say, a handful of people out on the streets, which is good. In fact, there's somebody there looking like they're probably going into their home, and maybe they're already starting to assess damage out on their streets, or out on the streets. But a lot of people are you know, staying put and hunkering down. Careful, Steve, okay, he's stopping. There's a coming. A lot of activity on the streets with cars, but people are actually not out of their homes. Either they're gone or they're inside and they're hunkered down, because I have not seen much activity, which I'm happy for, that people are just staying put. Now you can see some of these older homes. Steve, if you could just get this home over here, this kind of peach colored home, look at how the winds have kind of torn that siding or almost stripped it right off. It kind of reminds me of tornado damage in that way, that the winds will actually kind of what we call debark a tree, and it actually takes the bark right off the tree. It kind of looks like that on that home. These are older homes and wood structures. It doesn't take much to, really knock these around. But yeah, you can see here that this is, lots of power lines down, obviously big tree down in this person's lot. But thank goodness nobody lives in that lot. That looks to be a vacant lot. So it fell on the ground, but it didn't fall on that house. So that person there that we see walking, and it looks like maybe they're assessing the damage, got very lucky. Kev?
Thanks, Jacqueline. That I hope you're. I'm happy to hear actually that people are staying inside and not just being a bunch of curious cats and getting out before it's too safe. So yeah, stay safe, and we'll come back to see if there's any more damage in the next couple of hours. Okay, so
We're bringing you an update now on what is Hurricane Fiona.
It is on a collision course with the Maritimes.
Hurricane Fiona.
Fiona.
Winds in PEI's capital city, Charlottetown, are expected to gust to 140 kilometers per hour with the arrival of Fiona. Just how fast is that exactly? Cars typically travel down the highway at a speed of 110 kilometers per hour. A professional baseball pitcher's fastball travels at about 152 kilometers per hour. So, if a piece of debris gets picked up, you're looking at it traveling at a rate between a car and a fastball. Your best bet? Stay indoors. Some waves over the eastern portion of the Gulf of St. Lawrence could be higher than 12 meters. Just how high is that? That's about the size of a school bus on its side, or think of 12 full-length hockey sticks stacked on top of each other. Not something you want to come crashing down on top of you. As the storm makes landfall in Atlantic Canada, it's forecast to reach 1,500 kilometers in its widest diameter. That's about the distance from Halifax to Ottawa, Ontario, or 24,000 hockey rinks. Thankfully, we've got 4 teams on the ground covering this thing as it hits. Stay tuned to the Weather Network for updates.
Yeah, so we do have Nate back in Halifax. We'll be checking in with him. He's in his hometown there. So not the worst hit. That is very thankful. It's not that we want to see anyone else get hit, but that's just the biggest populated center in Atlantic Canada. So it is, for infrastructure-wise, it's a good thing Halifax hasn't taken a direct hit. I want to go back to the sea surface temperatures I was talking about earlier. This is really interesting, and it's almost another contributing factor to how this is almost the perfect storm. So this is just a little animation over the last 30 days of the difference in sea surface temperature from what we should be seeing. All those bright pinks, especially around Newfoundland, that was about 5 degrees above where it should be. And that's what actually contributed to places like Gander seeing their warmest 3 months of a summer on record. Now, over the last 2 weeks, through the middle of September, you see a lot of those pinks and even reds starting to fade right out, going right back to where they should be, with the exception of that water between Halifax and Sable Island. And that just happens to be exactly where Fiona tracks. So it's just like a little narrow runway coming right to Nova Scotia, and that is the last little bit of fuel that it was able to feed off of. So just another contributing factor to why this did become the historic and record-breaking storm that we were expecting. Now, I want to take a look at some of these wind gusts that we have had recorded. In terms of airports, that's where we get the most reliable stats. Right now in Atlantic Canada, the peak gust at an airport is in Sydney at 149 kilometers per hour. In terms of stations, when we have nor'easters or even just a strong fall storm, we'll often talk about the wreck house winds and the sweat winds, and they can quite often go maybe 130 to 140 in the strongest winter storms. So the thing with the winter storms is at that time, yes, there's a lot of pine trees out that way, but you can also get the deciduous trees, but they don't have the leaves on them, so you don't have as much resistance. But with that being said, the wreck house area has gone to 168 kilometers per hour, and that's the highest it's been recorded in Atlantic Canada for Fiona. But we have all those leaves still on the trees, as well as granitang on the east side of Cape Breton Island. You get that little bit of a downsloping enhancement from the highlands. Granitane gusted 166, and Beaver Island, Nova Scotia, is the third place that's reached 160. So incredibly impressive wind gusts. So these are actually on line of, or almost on proportion with a weaker tornado. But the thing is, it's a tornado. You'll have those gusts over a span of what, let's say 100, maybe 200 meters at the most. And these are happening over the spans of hundreds of kilometers. So that's one of the big differences with a hurricane. You might not get the extreme devastation with a strong tornado, but you're getting incredible devastation over a wider area. And that's why we have about 500,000 customers without power across the 4 provinces. Newfoundland, not the hardest hit areas as it stands right now, but you will have the most prolonged impacts by this through Saturday night. So I want to go back. We've been looking the last couple of days for our pressure record. So here's the stations we were looking at. These are the model ranges, and you can see the models range between 927 and 940 for Hart Island, and that's right in the middle of where the models were wanting to put the eye of the storm. So I'm going to say probably 3 to 4 days out, the models did an extraordinarily good job of pinpointing where this was going to make landfall. It did happen to make landfall right over that Hart Island station. So the lowest pressure bottomed out at 931.6. So it was actually a lot closer to the bottom end of that range than the top end. And normally you want to take the bottom ones, the extreme values. Naturally, you want to take them with a little bit of a grain of salt, especially when you can see the record was only at 940. So you want to have your wits about you when you see something outlying like that. But there's no doubt about it. This is now, in terms of pressure, the strongest storm to ever be recorded in Canada. And that is saying something, because this is one big country. So if we go back up to just some of our tracks right now, or information, what we have right now. Again, this is all still well organized. You see all those yellows and even some oranges on the west side of Fiona. That is what is now integrating the Arctic air. So if I'm just going to try to adjust this a little bit here, and actually let me take off some of that lower cloud to get a better idea of the land here. So if we just cut that off, let's get rid of those grays. We don't want any grays. There you have a better idea where the land is. So I'll put some towns on so everyone can get a better reference of where you may be. So back towards Montreal. Montreal, you're not seeing the outer bands right now. Quebec City, if you're in Quebec City, you're seeing those clouds that you're seeing kind of stretch from north to south above you right now. That is the western flank of the outer bands of Fiona. Now, if we go towards northern Quebec and we play this out, we're going to see how those clouds are a little lower, but they're coming in from the northwest. So that is all the Arctic air that is running into that boundary. So let's do a little analysis here on there's the leading edge of the tropical, let's say the tropical moisture is right, well, that's not working, but the green and the orange band there, that is the leading edge of all that moisture that's coming right up from the Caribbean. And then the grays to the west, that is all the Arctic air that's running into that. And that's why we're looking at the tropical snow that we've been talking about in Labrador and the north shore of Quebec and the higher elevations. So Quebec, none of the towns in Quebec are going to be seeing that snow, but it's definitely not something you're expecting when you have a hurricane, especially a major hurricane making landfall. You don't want to be talking about snow. So what we have here, now we're going to just take a look at some of the visuals that we have now that the sun's up. We're getting some great footage of not only the winds and the damage, but the waves are really, really impressive.
Here on the Magdalene Island, the winds are really picking up. We have recorded gusts well over 100 kilometers an hour. Actually, the biggest one was 132 kilometers an hour, which ties the all-time record for Magdalene Island.
We are in downtown Charlottetown and now getting a look at some of the damage early morning here as the sun's starting, or daylight's occurring, not really sun, but you see quite a bit of tree damage here by this car. This is on one of the side streets. Lots of tree branches snapped, like this one here, you can see, but probably more damage, more impressive damage, if you will, is over here by this church. There's a lot of tree limbs down here, like just widespread all over the place here. And one of these trees actually was uprooted. Oh, I gotta be careful, there's some power lines. Yeah, power lines, gotta be very careful. But check this out. And I mean, this has kind of been all over the city, like completely uprooted tree here. There you go. So there we go, that peak of the storm, this is what was happening here in Charlottetown. And this is just one little street. This is pretty widespread across the whole city.
Here on the Magdalene Island, the winds are really picking up. We have recorded gusts well over 100 kilometers an hour. Actually, the biggest one was 132 kilometers an hour, which ties the all-time record for Magdalene Island. As you can see behind me now, the sea is rising and starting to cover the roads with debris, and water is going to be flooding pretty soon. The problem also is that it's going to be conditions like that for the next 6 to 8 hours. So problems going to tumble more and more over the next hours.
So we finished off with Patrick there on Ile de la Madeleine. Not many people, especially outside of Atlantic Canada, have even heard of that incredible island. It is not rugged terrain. It's very low-lying, and it's right in the middle of the Gulf. And over the next couple hours through the morning, the center of the storm is going to be passing essentially over it. So we're going to see Patrick's going to experience some quickly shifting winds. We're going to go from more of an easterly wind to a southerly or northerly wind to a westerly wind. So that's going to be really interesting over the next couple hours to see what Patrick encounters there, and we'll likely see his strongest wind gusts coming in the next couple of hours. In terms of the storm surge, I want to reiterate the high tide has now been over an hour past, so we are heading in the right direction for the next 4 or 5 hours or so before we start seeing it come back up. The next high tide, the storm surge won't be as strong, especially the North Shore of Nova Scotia and the Gulf shores of New Brunswick and all of PEI, because we're going to be shifting from that northerly flow that's really damming the water in the southern Gulf to more of a westerly flow that's going to be actually pushing some of the storm surge back out to the open Atlantic. Now, in terms of our power outages, maybe if you're in the rest of Canada, you're wondering what maybe some of your friends or family out there, what they're dealing with. Well, here's some of the province by province breakdown. Nova Scotia, almost 400,000 customers are without power. We have power teams coming in from across the country and stateside to come into Atlantic Canada, because this is going to be an all hands on deck for days to come. So this is going to be a continuing story for in terms of the power outages. I just want to finish off our last minute here. We will be doing updates throughout the day. We're going to be coming to an end here. I just want to finish off with showing you our continuing watches and warnings right now. We'll likely see our storm surge warnings continue until our next high tide, and then goes without saying we still have our hurricane warnings in place for all of PEI and Cape Breton Island and the southwest shores of Newfoundland. That is where we're going to continue to see the strongest gusts, definitely through the remainder of the morning, early afternoon, and we'll continue to see those kind of wind warning caliber winds right until likely midnight, especially for western Newfoundland. So we've had some extraordinary stats that's been developing this morning. We have some great coverage, and we'll continue to bring that throughout the day here on the Weather Network, so check back in.